Hello, everyone, and welcome. Dr. Michael Greger coming to you live from my treadmill for this special pandemic webinar. We maxed out at 11,000 people registered, which is where our new Zoom limit caps us off. And so you are the lucky few that made it, the lucky 11,000. Let me just start with some housekeeping logistics while everyone gets settled in. If you can't hear me right now, there are instructions in the email that were sent out to tweak your audio settings. But if you can't hear me right now, you didn't hear that. So let me paste that into the chat box. Where's my chat? Oh, here's my chat box. All right. If at any time you run into technical difficulties, there are live chat Zoom staff standing by. Let me paste that link into the chat as well. If they're unable to help, we also have NutritionFacts.org staff standing by too, though presumably if the Zoom people can't help, I don't know what we can do, but want to give you as many possible options as I can. So I just chatted that to you as well. We will be taking a 5-minute break on the hour. So at 3 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Eastern, and 5 p.m., hoping to wrap up by 6 p.m. And let me put those breaks in the chat as well. All right, so if you have to pee and it's 2:55 p.m., if you can just hold it for 5 minutes, you won't have to miss anything. Let me just check in to make sure there are no major onboarding problems, and we are good to go. I think so. Excellent. It's beautiful to see quadruple digit participants, soon hopefully to be quintuple digit participants. Please reserve the Q&A button you see in the Zoom window there to ask content questions. I'll definitely be doing some Q&A at the end, but feel free to add your questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar, and the Nutrition Facts team will be compiling them, compiling the most commonly asked questions to be answered at the end. And so let me just put those instructions in there. All right. Now you may want to wait to see if I cover a topic first before asking your question. Here are the topics I am going to be covering today. Here we go. All right. And I'll also paste those in the chat box so you can follow along later. Let me pull up my chat box here. There we go. And where this disease came from in the first place, without an understanding of that, we won't be able to prevent future occurrences. So I'll be going through the last two deadly coronavirus outbreaks, MERS and SARS, and the origin story as we know it as far as the new coronavirus. Then I switched to who cares where it came from? It's here now, so what are we going to do about it? So I talk about how we successfully were able to beat back SARS, why that's more difficult with COVID-19, and what we have to do instead to slow the pandemic in the year or two before we even have a hope at a vaccine. Then I'll go through what COVID-19 is looking like clinically, if you get it, along with a sidebar discussion on the controversy around ACE inhibitor drugs and ibuprofen. Then I'll move on to the best way to treat COVID-19, a little sidebar on whether zinc lozenges may help. Not surprisingly, given our lack of good antiviral drugs, I'll conclude by saying the best way to treat it is to not to get it in the first place. So I'll talk about how to avoid the virus, then how to inactivate the virus. But if you do get it, how to treat yourself at home. I'll talk about the use of surgical masks, face coverings, then a sidebar on so-called N95 respirators and end with a section on discussion on where the pandemic is likely to go to from here. I'll then end my prepared videos with perhaps the most important discussion of all, the concept that as terrible as this pandemic is, there are much greater pandemic threats on the horizon. And most importantly, what we can do about it. The best way to survive a pandemic is not to have a pandemic in the first place. All right. Oh, what did I just do? Let me stop sharing. Okay. I will basically be covering the same breadth of material I did in last month's emergency webinar, but instead of me just as a talking head, I'll show you all the videos that I've prepared on all the topics so you can see all the papers and data yourself. You don't have to worry about taking notes or anything, because after the webinar is over, we're not only going to send you a full recording of it, but also a free link to download all the videos in full definition so you can see the videos in all their full resolution glory. These will all be going up on NutritionFacts.org starting at the end of this month and running through July. But because you signed up to this webinar, you can see them all right here, right now. Let us start with where do deadly coronaviruses come from? Let's find out. Okay. Okay, where? It was December 30th, 2019, New Year's Eve's Eve, when Dr. Li Wenliang, an ophthalmologist at Wuhan Central Hospital in the Hubei province of China, messaged his fellow physicians alerting them to the appearance of a concerning cluster of pneumonia cases. In response, he was detained for spreading rumors, summoned to the Public Security Bureau, and reprimanded for making false statements that disturbed the public order. 39 days later, after becoming infected with the very virus he tried to warn his colleagues about, he was dead at age 33. By that time, the disease had already spread to dozens of countries. My new book, How to Survive a Pandemic, is dedicated to Dr. Li's memory. His initial message read 7 SARS cases confirmed at the Huanan seafood market. SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, which 17 years earlier had been the first deadly global outbreak triggered by a coronavirus. Sadly, the doctor who first alerted the world to that pandemic, Carlo Urbani, also succumbed to the disease. Coronaviruses are named for their crown-like appearance under an electron microscope, from the Latin corona for crown, as in coronation, due to a fringe of protein spikes that radiate from the surface. I'm sure you've all seen those graphical representations, but this is what they actually look like under an electron microscope. You can see that halo of spikes. These are actually chicken coronaviruses, the first type of coronavirus ever discovered, which caused a disease called avian infectious bronchitis. Here's the COVID-19 coronavirus. It's a little hard to see the spikes, but they show up nice in this colorized version. Before the big outbreak of SARS in 2003, only 2 coronaviruses were known to cause disease in humans, and both caused little more than the common cold. But the SARS coronavirus went on to kill nearly 1 in 10 people it infected, a 10% mortality rate. A decade later, in 2012, another deadly coronavirus emerged, MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. Like SARS, MERS spread to infect thousands of people across dozens of countries, but this time 1 in 3 died, more than a 30% mortality rate. Emerged from where? Where do emerging infectious diseases emerge from? According to the CDC,
3/4 of new or emerging infectious diseases in people come from animals, based likely on this landmark study of the risk factors for human disease emergence, and it may be an even greater percentage for human viral infections, all of which may have originated in animals, been zoonotic in origin, meaning an animal-to-human disease. In the case of coronaviruses, most human coronaviruses appear to have arisen originally in bats. The reason bats make such good viral hosts is that up to 200,000 can crowd together in dense roosting colonies, and they can fly more than 1,000 miles acquiring and spreading new viral strains. Their unique navigational tool, echolocation, may even facilitate bat-to-bat transmission by spraying out respiratory secretions. But people aren't getting the disease directly from bats. Bats are considered the primordial host, the gene pool from which genetic fragments of coronaviruses can mix and match. Breaching the species barrier to infect people appears to necessitate intermediary hosts in whom coronaviruses can adapt, amplify, and access human populations. In the case of MERS, the intermediate hosts were found to be camels. A bat in Saudi Arabia was found carrying the MERS coronavirus, but it is contact with the bodily fluids of infected camels, particularly their nasal secretions, that is considered the major risk factor for human infection. Once camels infect people, MERS can then be spread human to human. And now, of course, those in the camel business denied the link between MERS and camel exposure. In response to the warnings that those in close camel contact wear personal protective equipment at all times, they launched with a social media campaign entitled, and I'm not making this up, "Kiss Your Camel." But wait, we domesticated camels 3,000 years ago. What happened to turn camel slobber into a potential kiss of death? Archived samples of camel blood show MERS had long been circulating in them for decades before spilling over into the human population. Why now? Camels used to be allowed to forage outdoors, but as more and more camels were being raised, desertification from overgrazing forced the industry to transition to thousands of camel farms using enclosed high-density housing systems where they were confined indoors. And the high-intensity contact between camels alongside their workers is thought to be what helped drive the spillover of the MERS coronavirus from camels to humans. By 2011, open grazing was completely banned in Qatar, the Middle Eastern country with the highest camel density. The next year, the first human cases of MERS were reported. In my next video, I'll cover the emergence of the SARS coronavirus, and then the emergence of SARS coronavirus 2, the cause of COVID-19. SARS was the first new global disease outbreak of the 21st century, which went on to cause about 8,000 cases and about 800 deaths. Many of the first cases of SARS were tied to the same kind of place most of the first cases of COVID-19 were linked to: live animal wet markets in China. Freshly slaughtered animals are thought to be more nutritious by many regional consumers, and some seek yowei, the wild taste, believing the consumption of exotic animals bestows benefits to health and social status. This convergence, fresh slaughter with exotic animals, leads to a perfect storm for disease transmission, where crowded cages in these wet markets are contaminated with the blood, urine, and feces of countless species mixed together in a potential cauldron of contagion. There was a vast expansion of the wildlife trade in the 1990s to supply the emerging urban middle-class demand, driven, according to the World Bank, predominantly by demand for wild animal products in China. Many of the wild animals, typically while alive, enter China through Vietnam from Laos, where the wildlife meat trade rose to become the second-largest income source for rural families. Markets there sell a ton of animals, literally, many of which are critically endangered. Then, as demand surpassed supply, the cross-country wildlife trade was supplemented with the creation of intensive captive production farms, where a menagerie of wild animals are often raised under poor sanitation and unnatural stocking densities before being transported and caged at markets for sale. 14 million people are involved in China's wildlife farming industry, valued at $74 billion. The genetic building blocks for the SARS virus have since been identified from 11 different strains of coronaviruses found in Chinese bats, but there are bat-borne coronaviruses around the world. The reason China, in particular, has been ground zero for multiple jumps of deadly human coronavirus epidemics may be because of these wet markets. In the case of SARS, the intermediate host appeared to be the masked palm civet, a cat-like animal prized for its meat. In addition to being raised for their flesh, civet cat penis is soaked in rice wine for use as an aphrodisiac. These animals also produce the most expensive coffee in the world. So-called fox dung coffee is produced by feeding coffee beans to captive civets and then recovering the partially digested beans from their feces. I don't know if you can actually see, but those are actually civet turds. A musk-like substance of buttery consistency secreted by the anal glands gives the coffee its characteristic flavor and smell. One might say this unique drink is good to the last dropping. Coronaviruses acquired from civets in live animal markets were almost identical to the SARS virus, while civets at wildlife farms supplying the live markets were found largely free of infection. Up to 80% of sampled civets at the markets showed evidence of exposure. This suggests that most infections happened at the market, perhaps due to the combination of crowded interspecies mixing and the immunosuppressive effect of stress. Live animal markets not only allow for cross-species transmission, viral amplification, and human exposure, but viral modification too. The SARS coronavirus exploited opportunities provided by wet markets in southern China to adapt to the palm civet and humans. Apparently, civets were not just passive conduits for the virus, they appear to be incubators for human-adapting mutations in the virus itself. The virus uses its corona of spikes like a key in a lock to latch onto host receptors to gain entry into the victim's cells. To switch from infecting one species to another, the genes that code for the spikes have to mutate to fit into the new host's receptors. A new lock requires a new key. Both the SARS coronavirus and SARS coronavirus 2, the virus that causes COVID-19, attach to a specific enzyme coating the cells of our lungs. By the time a mishmash of bat coronaviruses made it into civets, the docking spikes of the virus were only 2 mutations away from locking in the configuration that bound to human receptors, and then the human-to-human SARS epidemic was born. After the initial SARS outbreak ended in 2003, new human cases were confirmed tied to a restaurant serving civets. Unlike most of the previous cases, the new victims presented with mild symptoms and didn't seem to pass it on. Viruses sampled from palm civets at both a local market and the restaurant were found to be nearly identical to those discovered in the new milder human cases. The new civet viruses shared only one of the 2 civet-to-human spike mutations found in all the new human patients, but none of the previous year's civets coronaviruses. These findings suggest that intermediate hosts can help transform coronaviruses from the primordial reservoir in bats into greater human infectivity. Yes, bats are trapped for meat in Asia, and many bat hunters do report getting bitten. Yes, the handling and consumption of undercooked bat meat is still practiced in China, Guam, and other parts of Asia, but it appears intermediate hosts may be needed as a stepping stone for bat coronaviruses to adapt to humans to trigger a human pandemic. And it's hard to imagine a system that could be better designed to facilitate that process than a live animal wet market. In response to the SARS outbreak, the Chinese government implemented strict controls over the wildlife market, including a ban on the sale of civet cats. Though the permanent closure of live animal markets has been called the strongest deterrent to another zoonotic disease outbreak, within months the ban was lifted, and trade resumed as before. Civets were back on the menu. Had authorities in China learned its lesson from SARS and listened to experts, and enacted a permanent ban on live animal markets, it's possible humanity would not now be suffering the worst pandemic in a century.
Sorry about the audio last time. That was totally my fault. Didn't have the microphone plugged in. Didn't miss anything. I was just telling people to not kiss camels, and wondering what animal to not smooch to start a SARS pandemic or SARS epidemic, and we just learned it's the civet cat, another animal to add to the no smooch list. Next, I'm going to be addressing where did the COVID-19 virus come from. Hopefully you'll see the connections and understand why it was important to kind of lay out the SARS emergence story for context, since they both appear to come from the same place, these live animal wet markets in China.
A review published in the December 2019 issue of the journal Infectious Disease Clinics of North America concluded the SARS epidemic demonstrated that novel, highly pathogenic, highly disease-causing viruses crossing the animal-human barrier remain a major threat to global health security. Little did the authors know that by the date of publication, just such a virus was brewing. It will not be surprising if new coronaviruses emerge in the near future. Read another review a few months before. It is highly likely that future SARS or MERS-like coronavirus outbreaks will originate from bats, and there is an increased probability that this will occur in China. These warnings aren't new, dating back more than a decade. The presence of a large reservoir of SARS-like coronaviruses in bats, together with the culture of eating exotic mammals in southern China, is a time bomb. A time bomb that just went off. Now I hope you can understand how Dr. Lee's 7 SARS cases confirmed forewarning was so ominous. That's why I did the last video about SARS, because it gives some context. It wasn't the SARS coronavirus he found, though, the cause of SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, but instead a virus that would come to be known as SARS coronavirus 2, the cause of COVID-19, short for coronavirus disease 2019. Before it became known as SARS-CoV-2, though, it was just the Wuhan seafood market pneumonia virus. According to the director of the Chinese CDC, ground zero for the COVID-19 pandemic was the Hunan market in Wuhan, China, where most of the first human cases could be traced back. Described as the largest wholesale seafood market in central China, the Hunan market reportedly also sold 75 species of wild animals. If you want to see what that part of the market looked like, you can go to bit.ly/Hunan market, but I'm not going to show the photos because some may find them disturbing. Although there are fish coronaviruses, 90% of the samples that turned up positive for the virus were found in the section of the 500,000 square foot seafood market where those photos were taken, the part that trafficked in exotic animals sold for food. The fact that the genetic sequences of the viruses obtained from some of the earliest human victims were 99.9% identical, despite the rapid mutation rate of coronaviruses, suggests the current pandemic originated within a very short period from a single source. Although there have been documented reports of the original SARS coronavirus escaping from laboratories, the fact that the COVID-19 coronavirus was optimized for binding to human cells in a novel way suggests that the new pandemic we now face was not made in some laboratory, but rather through natural means, though to lock in the necessary mutations, the animal host would probably have to have a high population density. The new coronavirus appears to share a common ancestor with the original SARS virus, for which it's about 80% identical, but it's more than 95% identical with a coronavirus found in a bat in 2013. The current thinking is that the COVID-19 virus originated in bats, but then jumped to humans only after passing through an intermediate host. The pandemic emerged in winter, after all, when most bat species in Wuhan are hibernating, and no bats were reportedly found at the Huanan market. There were labs in the proximity of the market where bat viruses might have escaped, but the virus was found in environmental samples taken directly from the market. Unfortunately, the market was closed and cleared before the animals themselves were tested, complicating the forensic search for the source. In the case of SARS, the intermediate host between bats and human-to-human transmission was the civet. In MERS, it was camels. What was the intermediate host for COVID-19? The leading candidate for the stepping stone civet of the current outbreak is the pangolin. Also known as scaly anteaters, pangolins look like a cross between a sloth and a pine cone. But between the demand for their meat as a delicacy and their scales for use in traditional Chinese medicine, pangolins are the most trafficked mammal in the world. Pangolins are served in high-end restaurants in China. Once the order is placed, the animal may be hammered until it is unconscious, and then slaughtered in front of the customers as a guarantee of the meat's freshness. The blood is drained and usually given to the customer to bring home or use to make pangolin blood fried rice. Coronaviruses from two separate batches of diseased pangolins being smuggled into China were found to be about 90% identical with the COVID-19 virus. Not only is the pangolin the only other mammal found to be infected with SARS-CoV-2-like viruses, but the critical receptor binding region of the pangolin coronavirus spike protein is virtually identical to the human strain. Work is still underway, but whichever the animal was, that one meal, that one medicine, may have ended up costing humanity a few $1 trillion and a few million lives. Given the role exotic animal trafficking appears to have played in the current global health crisis, some of the international scientific community have called for a ban on the sale of wild animals and the closure of live animal markets. Even infectious disease experts within Wuhan started calling for completely eradicating wildlife trading. On January 26, 2020, the Chinese government responded, announcing a total ban on the trade and sale of wild animal meat, reportedly shutting down or quarantining almost 20,000 wildlife farms across 7 Chinese provinces, though the ban is only set to be temporary. After the SARS outbreak in 2003, Chinese officials enacted a similar ban on the trade of civet cats, but within months, the ban was lifted, and the animals were back on the menu. Much of the wildlife trade was already illegal in China in the first place, with flaunted bans dating back more than a decade. The Chinese pangolin, for example, is officially considered a critically endangered species. That's part of the draw, though, as a serving of extra rare meat may project prestige and wealth. A thriving black market already exists and could potentially be driven further underground by government action. The ultimate solution, wrote a group of Chinese scientists, lies in changing people's minds about what is delicious, trendy, prestigious, or healthy to eat. Having spent the bulk of my professional life trying to get people to eat more healthfully to prevent chronic disease, I can certainly relate. In the unlikely event the current ban was to be made permanent and was enforced effectively, there remains a glaring loophole. The ban exempts the use of wild animals for traditional Chinese medicine, so while it's currently illegal to eat pangolin meat, it's not illegal to eat other pangolin parts. How ironic that the pandemic appears to have arisen in a market selling remedies purported to promote immunity and longevity. Pangolin blood is said to promote circulation. For only about $30 a pound, anyone can go online and buy Chinese bat feces to treat their eye disorders. While the drying of excrement would presumably inactivate coronavirus, the trade and handling of live and recently killed bats for their use in traditional remedies could infect people directly, or certainly introduce opportunities for cross-infection with susceptible animal hosts. Now, it's easy for xenophobic Westerners to condemn cultures consuming rhino horns, tiger bones, and pangolin scales, or 21st century manifestations such as mukbangs, live-streaming broadcasts of people eating bat soup and the like. But, as I discuss in my new book, the last pandemic, the 2009 H1N1 swine flu virus, arose not from some backwater wet market in Asia, but rather was largely made in the USA from industrial pig operations in the United States. So for the emergence of SARS-CoV-3, we may need look no further than our own plates.
SARS and COVID-19 aren't the only deadly coronaviruses to come out of China in recent years, and civets and pangolins aren't the only potential intermediate hosts. If I were a betting man, I would peg pigs as the source of the next coronavirus pandemic. In fact, the last coronavirus pandemic may have been caused by livestock. Check it out.
Before I take a deep dive into COVID-19, I wanted to touch on some of the new coronaviruses emerging in livestock. As we've seen, COVID-19 is only one of many coronavirus diseases to jump from bats in the 21st century to cause deadly outbreaks. There was SARS in 2002, MERS in 2012, and then SADS in 2016, a new disease killing up to 90% of young piglets. SADS, swine acute diarrhea syndrome, devastated industrial pig farms in the same region in China where SARS had broken out. SADS was traced to a coronavirus discovered in a bat cave in the vicinity, so one could say coronaviruses can infect pigs right off the bat. The combination of deforestation and intensive pork production, with millions of pigs encroaching on bat habitat, may have facilitated the coronavirus spillover from bats to pigs. Then there's porcine epidemic diarrhea, another presumed bat-to-pig coronavirus. In 2010, a highly virulent strain emerged in China that caused massive outbreaks when it hit the United States and spread coast to coast a few years later, killing millions of pigs, approximately 10% of the entire U.S. herd. Then there's porcine delta coronavirus, the third new pig coronavirus to emerge from China in the last decade, rapidly spreading once it reached U.S. shores in 2014. This pattern of emergence and outbreaks of new coronaviruses in livestock appears to be accelerating, facilitated by intensive confinement practices resulting in thousands of animals being housed together in a closed environment. The pattern of new human coronavirus outbreaks also appears to be accelerating, but currently none of these emerging pig coronaviruses appears able to infect humans. Nevertheless, continued monitoring of these pig coronaviruses is necessary for not just pig, but public health, because coronaviruses are known for their high rates of mutation, and their recombination, the process by which viruses swap parts of their genetic code to better adapt to their hosts or find new ones. The fact that many livestock coronaviruses cause persistent epidemic infections increases the likelihood that a coronavirus mutant could arise with what's called an extended host range, meaning the potential to invite humanity to the party. To trigger a pandemic, the virus would first have to spread to the lungs. Most coronaviruses in bats and livestock to date have been intestinal infections. The exception is infectious bronchitis virus in chickens, which was actually the first coronavirus ever discovered back in 1931, and was to become the major cause of respiratory infections in the 9 billion chickens raised for meat in the United States every year, but is prevalent in all countries with industrial poultry production, with infection rates often approaching 100%. Currently, the only way IBV has been shown to cause disease in mammals, though, is by being directly injected into the brain. But with so many different coronaviruses circulating among so many different species, it's considered likely not a matter of if, but when the next recombinant coronavirus will emerge and explode into the human population. Already, the spikes of the newly discovered porcine delta coronavirus in pigs that has posed such a serious threat to the pork industry can attach to receptors not only in pig intestines, but also in the respiratory tract of humans. This broad receptor engagement of an emerging global coronavirus may potentiate its diverse cross-species transmissibility. We already know porcine delta coronaviruses can infect both human and chicken cells in a petri dish, and we know it can infect chickens themselves, just like there's a bovine coronavirus in calves that can infect turkeys. These coronaviruses jump around, and once they do, which is even more concerning, like porcine delta coronavirus, once it jumps to chickens, can then spread rapidly from chicken to chicken. In fact, this new paper, published February 2020 in the CDC's Emerging Infectious Diseases Journal, just concluded that given the susceptibility of human cells to infection, porcine delta coronavirus should be investigated for its pandemic health risk to humans. The SARS coronavirus can also infect human cells in a petri dish and infect mice in a laboratory. In fact, a team of researchers concluded in an upcoming December 2022 issue of the Journal of Virology that given the ability of SARS coronavirus to grow efficiently in human cell lines, we should not underestimate the risk that this bat-origin coronavirus may jump from pigs to humans. Bottom line, pigs, not just pangolins, may act as the mixing vessels for the generation of new coronaviruses with pandemic potential. Coronaviruses are increasingly emerging and circulating among livestock populations around the world. The more new coronaviruses we have mixing in more and more animals, the greater the likelihood that strains with pandemic potential may emerge. While global pangolin populations are in drastic decline, we produce and slaughter more than 1 billion pigs a year, about half in China alone, raising the specter that the next pandemic may arise from domestic rather than wild animals, an event that may actually have already happened. The last coronavirus pandemic may have been caused by livestock. Wait, the last coronavirus pandemic? Hear me out. Coronaviruses are the second most common cause of the common cold. So far, we've discovered 4 human cold coronaviruses, so that makes 7 coronaviruses in all that can cause human disease, the 6 listed here plus COVID-19. We suspect we got SARS from civets, MERS from camels, and the COVID-19 virus perhaps from pangolins. Where did we get the 4 common cold coronaviruses? The origin of 2 of the 4 mild coronaviruses remain a mystery, but one, called human coronavirus 229E, has been traced back to camels, and the other, called OC43, to cattle or pigs. Well, if the jump by the common cold from camels to humans foreshadowed the deadly MERS species jump that went on to kill 1 in 3 people, might the coronavirus jump from livestock to humans portend a deadly human outbreak as well? It may already have. So-called molecular clock analyses dating the emergence of human coronavirus OC43 suggest that the bovine coronavirus, now causing so-called shipping fever in cattle, jumped to humans around the year 1890. Cows to humans in 1890. That's interesting timing. There was a pandemic in 1890. While the 1890 pandemic was presumed to be influenza, the timing of the emergence of human coronavirus OC43 has led some to conjecture that it instead may have been a SARS-like or COVID-19-like interspecies transmission of a coronavirus. Maybe it was just a coincidence, though? Well, it's not just the timing. There seemed to be a lot of neurological symptoms during that pandemic, and that's relatively unusual for influenza and more characteristic of a coronavirus. But the most compelling data, to me, is the fact that there was this highly infectious respiratory disease raging in cattle. And in the years leading up to the pandemic, 1870 to 1890, there were massive culling operations to eradicate the disease devastating cattle herds the world over, ample opportunity for lots of respiratory secretion exposure. Now, we may never know what caused the 1890 pandemic, but we can take steps to prevent the next one. And that's a subject I dive deep into in my new book. Yes, I go into how to best protect yourself and your family, your community from COVID-19, but I also address pandemic prevention. The best way to survive a pandemic is not to have one in the first place.
Okay, so now we got all the background out of the way. Now let's get down to business with COVID-19. You may have heard the term R naught. What is it? And what does it have to do with stopping COVID-19 and past coronavirus epidemics? Let's find out.
I've talked about the emergence of other deadly coronavirus outbreaks like SARS and MERS. How were we able to get them under control? MERS could be stopped because of its relatively low basic reproduction number, abbreviated as R with a little subscript 0. That's the R naught you may have heard about. The reason they call it the reproduction number is because the concept goes back to the study of human population growth, like the number of daughters on average each woman had. But in infectious disease, it represents the number of people a single infected individual is expected to pass the disease along to in a susceptible population. So R naught is a measure of how contagious a new pathogen is. For the MERS coronavirus, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, the R naught was only about 1. So each MERS patient tended to transmit the disease to only one other person. You can imagine how much easier a disease like that can be stopped compared to a virus with the potential to spread exponentially. Viruses like the SARS or COVID-19 coronaviruses with an R naught of 2 or greater. In the case of a virus with an R naught of 2, for example, unless stopped, one infected person could become 2, then 4, then 8, and so on. The coronavirus that causes COVID-19 may indeed be able to latch onto receptors in the human respiratory tract better than the coronavirus that causes SARS, and also replicate better in the upper airways than SARS. But the primary reason there were more COVID-19 cases in the first month after it was reported than SARS ever caused revolves less around how contagious it is and more around when it is contagious. The three characteristics of microbes most likely to cause pandemics are novelty, a new pathogen, so there's no pre-existing immunity; respiratory spread, I mean, pneumonia is humanity's fourth leading killer even outside a pandemic; and the third characteristic for optimal pandemic potential, transmission before symptom onset. The last four pandemics of respiratory disease were caused by new flu viruses, originating from bird flu and swine flu viruses, each of which fit all three of those criteria. SARS, however, was not considered a pandemic, despite spreading to 29 countries and regions. Why did the World Health Organization only consider SARS a public health emergency of international concern, and how were we able to stop it within just a few months at only around 8,000 cases and 800 deaths? It was a brand new virus, spread via respiratory droplets, but SARS lacked the third necessary characteristic, significant spread before symptoms arise. For SARS, the average incubation period, the time between first becoming unwittingly infected after exposure to the virus and first coming down with symptoms, was around 5 days, similar to COVID-19. But it took another 6 to 11 days, however, for SARS viral loads to fully ramp up and upper respiratory tract secretions coughed or sneezed from one person to the next. So even after falling ill, patients with SARS weren't very infectious in the first 5 days or so of the illness. Since viral loads peaked about 10 days after people started feeling sick, after they knew they had it, you could see how human-to-human transmission could be stopped if patients could be isolated within the first few days after the onset of symptoms. And that's exactly what happened. A massive international effort spearheaded by the WHO was able to identify all the cases by their symptoms, isolate the patients, and trace all their contacts. That's how we were able to effectively eradicate smallpox for the planet, too, with a vaccine the same way. Smallpox was also only contagious after you knew who had it. So fever screening at airports helped stop the global spread of SARS in its tracks. You didn't become particularly infectious until after symptoms started, and 100% of SARS patients developed a fever. In a way, SARS was a disease designed to be stopped. With MERS, 98% of the patients became febrile, meaning got a fever. In the case of COVID-19, though, as many as 36%, more than 1 in 3, do not present with fever, this nice objective symptom, at the onset of symptoms. More seriously, patients may be infectious during the incubation period without any symptoms at all. In fact, the viral load in an asymptomatic patient with COVID-19 was found to be similar to that of symptomatic patients, as many as 15 million viral copies within every quarter teaspoon of snot. Same amount of virus in symptomatic snot, taken from someone who just turned sick, compared to asymptomatic snot, spewing just as much virus right before you get sick. With COVID-19, you can feel perfectly fine, no symptoms at all, but actually have the disease and spread the disease before the first cough, before you get a fever or any symptoms. It's the same thing with the flu. That's how new flu viruses can trigger pandemics too. Like the flu, you can potentially spread COVID-19 before you know you have it, even while you're feeling perfectly fine. That's a disease that's hard to stop. To slow the spread of that kind of disease, where you don't know who's infectious and who's not, you have to try isolating everyone. That's where social distancing measures are required.
All right, okay, so now I'm going to get into social distancing, lockdowns, testing, what we can do as a society to slow down the COVID-19 pandemic.
I've talked about where the COVID-19 coronavirus came from and how we might prevent such emergencies from animals in the future, but now that it's spreading human to human, what can we do about it? Social distancing. That's what each of us can do. Locking down cities, closing non-essential businesses, canceling gatherings, and encouraging people to shelter in place at home are all old-school public health strategies to break every possible chain of transmission. China was condemned for its early response, sanctioning critics and denying the extent of the crisis, referring to it as preventable and controllable, similar to the response of other world leaders. But China was later lauded for that same authoritarian approach when it came to successfully enacting extreme quarantine measures. A top WHO official praised China's efforts as probably the most ambitious, and I would say agile and aggressive disease containment effort in history. It was, however, too little too late to contain the disease locally. By the time authorities banned travel out of Wuhan, more than a third of the 14 million residents had already left the region, whether for the Chinese New Year holiday or to flee before the lockdown of the city went into effect on January 23. One could argue that had local officials not wasted weeks silencing whistleblowers and releasing fake reports, the world could have been spared this pandemic. But the aggressive actions China subsequently did take may have indeed brought us all some time. Enacting so-called wartime control measures, China initiated the largest community containment effort in history, affecting about 750 million people. Borders were closed, cities were sealed off, and people were confined to their homes. Unlike so-called lockdowns other countries started instituting, like the U.S., that still allowed people to venture freely outside as long as they respected a certain personal distance, in China, citizens were totally restricted, with permission cards that only allowed them to leave their home every second day for a maximum of 30 minutes for essentials. The policy was criticized by human rights advocates, but it worked. The epidemic immediately started decelerating. Chinese authorities achieved what many public health experts didn't think was possible, the containment of the spread of a widely circulating respiratory infection. Within 2 months, Hubei province, ground zero where the disease first emerged, reported its first day of no new local cases. "I will praise China again and again," said the Director General of the World Health Organization, "because its actions actually helped in reducing the spread of the novel coronavirus to other countries. In many ways, China is actually setting a new standard for outbreak response." Of course, the day Hubei province recorded no new cases, the world confirmed its 200,000th case. Would the rest of the world be willing to enact rules one global health policy specialist called astounding, unprecedented, and medieval? The Command and Control Authority of the Chinese government allowed them to enforce a resource-intensive containment strategy that involved cost to trade, travel, and liberty that many doubted democracies would be able to stomach. Thankfully, successful strategies in countries such as South Korea showed that such draconian measures may not be necessary. All the nations that were able to get the disease under control quickly relied on the foundation of testing and tracing. In other words, identify all cases through mass testing, and then trace every possible contact each patient had, to break as many chains of transmission as possible through isolation and quarantine. South Korea had a test approved within the first week of February, and with enough testing, was able to bring the disease under control by the end of the month. With such expansive, well-organized testing, countries like South Korea were able to control the epidemic without resorting to locking down its populace. The World Health Organization took notice. "We have a simple message to all countries," the Director General declared: test, test, test. The United States did not appear to get the message in time. By mid-March, South Korea had already tested more than 250,000 of its citizens, more than 5,000 out of every million, compared to fewer than 100 per million in the United States. Hamstrung by FDA red tape and a series of blunders, sufficient U.S. testing capacity failed to materialize before the window on containment closed. And it's humbling to realize that the U.S. and South Korea recorded their first cases on the same day, yet the ensuing epidemics took very different courses. Once containment fails, the strategy then shifts to suppression and mitigation. If you don't know who's infected, all you can do is try to prevent everyone from coming in contact with anyone. By April, most Americans were being told to stay home to try to curb the spread. As Dr. Fauci said at a press conference, if it looks like you're overreacting, you're probably doing the right thing. Closing non-essential businesses and encouraging people to stay inside to limit social contacts are efforts taken in an attempt to flatten the curve before it flattens us. Flatten the epidemic curve. In other words, slow the spread of the illness to more evenly distribute the cases over time. This would give health systems time to scale up and respond effectively, not only to treat COVID-19, but to maintain overall care continuity. During the recent Ebola crisis in West Africa, for example, deaths increased from other causes as well due to the saturation of the healthcare system, as well as the death of healthcare workers. School closures are more controversial, as they could threaten the availability of the 29% of healthcare providers in this country who live in households that would need to take care of young children. One model suggested that school closures might have to reduce COVID-19 cases by more than 25% to make up for the loss of healthcare workers in terms of an overall net reduction in COVID-19 mortality. A 25% drop may be achievable for pandemic influenza, a disease in which children may play a critical role in community transmission, but children don't appear to be the main drivers of the transmission of COVID-19. Until an effective vaccine is widely available, likely not until 2021 at the earliest, population lockdowns can help rob the virus of susceptible hosts. Once such measures are relaxed, though, the disease could come roaring back. In the pandemic of 1918, for example, some U.S. cities experienced a second peak in mortality following the lifting of social distancing measures. Check out what happened in St. Louis. As soon as they detected a doubling of the baseline mortality, they instituted school closures and a ban on public gatherings, and you can see how they were successfully able to bend the curve, so they decided it was time to relax the social distancing, and they got a big spike in new cases that required a reinstitution of the shutdown measures. But the important thing is they instituted the social distancing early, within days of their first case. Compare that to how Philadelphia reacted. It took them weeks to shut the city down, and they suffered the consequences. Here's a graph of that double-hump death rate in St. Louis compared to what they suffered in Philadelphia. And here's the mass graves they then had to dig in the city of brotherly love. It's better to be 6 feet apart than 6 feet under. By periodically pumping the brake with flattening the curve strategies like shelter-in-place ordinances to slow community transmission, the hope is that we can turn the initial tidal wave of cases into a series of smaller successive waves our healthcare capability can more safely ride out. If not, more intensive care units in U.S. hospitals may become overwhelmed, just as they did in Italy, and doctors will have to make triage decisions as to who lives and who dies. Triage protocols have already been published. First in line for ventilators are those who are most likely to survive, both in the short term and over the subsequent year. Then the priority goes to children and adults under the age of 50. Those 50 to 69 are in the next tier, followed by those aged 70 to 84, and then finally lowest priority is given to patients 85 and older. If there's a tie, life-saving ventilation may be allocated based on some form of lottery, like flipping a coin. In the New England Journal of Medicine, a preeminent group of medical ethics experts wrote, "We believe that removing a patient from a ventilator or an ICU bed to provide it to others in need is also justifiable, and that patients should be made aware of this possibility when they're admitted to the hospital." Adding, "The decision to withdraw a scarce resource to save others is not an act of killing and does not require the patient's consent." Wow, can you imagine? To relieve the frontline clinicians of the burden, they suggest the designation of triage officers to make the decisions. The countries that were able to mobilize the fastest and have been able to best control COVID-19 were those who had learned hard lessons from previous outbreaks. China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan bear the memories of SARS. More recently, South Korea suffered a MERS outbreak in 2015, triggered by a businessman returning from the Middle East. The country's test and trace infrastructures were therefore in place, and its population is primed to sacrifice for the promise of containment. If outbreaks involving dozens or even hundreds of deaths can rally countries to a state of pandemic preparedness, perhaps the thousands or even millions of deaths from COVID-19 will orient countries of the world to the mission of pandemic prevention. But first, what can each of us do individually to ride out the current pandemic? That's what I'll cover next.
But before we cover that, it is time to pee. We got 5 minutes. I'll put it on the clock, and we'll be back then to continue our pandemic webinar.
What does the clinical course of
All right. Thank you to all the thousands out there who are joining in. We talked about what we can do on a societal level about COVID-19, but what can we do on an individual level? First, let me go through the clinical course of COVID-19. For example, how do you differentiate between the symptoms of the new coronavirus, the flu, a cold, or just allergies? Let's see. Let's see what the video, I think I'm video 7. 777. This is it. Here we go.
What does the clinical course of COVID-19 look like? It tends to start with fever and cough, but before then, the average incubation period, the time between the moment you get sufficiently exposed to the virus and the moment you start showing symptoms, seems to be about 5 days. So almost a week goes by when you're infected and potentially infectious before you even know it. About 98% of those who are gonna start showing symptoms do so by day 12, which explains why people are typically asked to self-quarantine for 2 weeks after a potential exposure. After infection, apparent viral shedding may continue for more than a month, with an average of 20 days, though it's not clear how contagious survivors are, if at all, during that extended time period. The most common symptoms are fever and cough, experienced by about 90% and 70% of patients respectively, based on an analysis of more than 50,000 COVID-19 patients. In terms of less common symptoms, only about 4 in 10 experience fatigue, 3 in 10 cough up phlegm, and 2 in 10 experience muscle aches. Only about 1 in 10 suffer from gastrointestinal symptoms, such as nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea, or common cold-type symptoms like a runny or stuffy nose, headache, or a sore throat. This is consistent with the regional concentration of ACE2, the receptors the virus latches onto, in the lungs rather than the nose or throat, though in pangolins, ACE2 is found on their flicking anteater tongues. Here's a chart that can help you differentiate between COVID-19, the common cold, the flu, or seasonal allergies. The only COVID-19 symptom found predictive of a more severe course was difficulty breathing, which resulted in more than 6 times the odds of eventually having to be admitted into the ICU. That's why that's such an important symptom to catch early, and a red flag to immediately seek medical attention. If it's gonna strike, shortness of breath usually hits a week after symptoms begin. The notion that the course of about 80% of cases are quote-unquote mild was derived from an analysis by the Chinese CDC that was based on nearly 45,000 confirmed cases. While there are certainly mild and even asymptomatic cases, it's important to understand what mild means to the Chinese CDC. Its definition of mild included those with so-called walking pneumonia, meaning pneumonia not dire enough to require supplemental oxygen or hospitalization, but pneumonia nonetheless. Certainly not the common cold-type courses people might think of when they hear the word mild, though the cases were at least mild enough that people should be able to treat themselves at home. The remaining 20 or so percent of confirmed cases were classified as severe, about 15%, which involved difficulty getting enough oxygen, or critical, 5%, encompassing respiratory failure, septic shock, and multi-system organ failure. About half of those critical cases died. So about 80% mild, 15% severe, and 5% critical, though that doesn't include all the asymptomatic cases that escaped detection completely and never become confirmed cases at all. Because as many as 4/5 of cases are asymptomatic, the risk of dying after being infected may end up ranging from 1 in 1,000 to about 1 in 300, though if you do show symptoms, the risk of death may be more like 1 in 150. On autopsy, The respiratory surface of the lung under a microscope appears obliterated by scar tissue. Pulmonary fibrosis, lung scarring, is expected to become one of the long-term complications among survivors of serious COVID-19 infection. A 6-month follow-up of SARS survivors found that about 1 in 3 showed evidence of scarring on X-ray, and up to 1 in 6 suffered a significant impairment in lung function. Death from COVID-19 comes from progressive consolidation of the lung, meaning your lungs start filling up with something other than air. In the case of regular pneumonia, that's largely pus. In COVID-19 pneumonia, postmortems show you drown in lungs that are filled with clear liquid jelly. But the good news is that there are modifiable risk factors for death and disability from COVID-19, meaning things you have control over that can reduce your risk, which we'll explore next.
All right. I know it can be frustrating seeing all the data kind of flash by so fast, not being able to stop and pause. But remember, you're going to get a download link to download all these videos for free in high def. And so you can watch them over and over, fast forward, rewind, whatever you want to do. All right, next up, I'm going to talk about modifiable risk factors and comorbidities for severe COVID-19 infection. These are things you can do right now to reduce your risk of falling seriously ill or dying from this disease.
The severity of COVID-19 varies widely based on pre-existing conditions. Those with high blood pressure at twice the odds of suffering a severe course, and those with cardiovascular disease 3 times the odds. What's more, those with either condition are about 4 times more likely to end up in the ICU. Those with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases like emphysema, appear to be at the highest risk, with 6 times the odds of a severe course for COVID-19 and nearly 18 times the odds of admission to an intensive care unit. We know that exposure to air pollution can increase susceptibility to respiratory viral infections, and that may be the case with COVID-19 as well, as higher pollutant levels appear to be correlated with pandemic deaths. But just as air pollution may influence COVID-19, COVID-19 may be influencing air pollution. Check out this satellite data from NASA. This is nitrogen dioxide pollutant levels before the pandemic, then after lockdown. Here's what Ground Zero Wuhan province looked like at around the same time last year, and then post-pandemic. Ready for some irony? The decrease in air pollution following the quarantine is so great that the COVID-19 pandemic may paradoxically have decreased the total number of deaths by drastically decreasing the number of fatalities due to air pollution, averting as many as 30,000 deaths a month in China. In other words, the air quality in China was so bad that COVID-19 may have ended up saving lives, like 1,000 lives a day. A history of smoking is a risk factor for disease progression, though surprisingly, active smoking may or may not be. This seeming paradox may provide a clue as to why those with high blood pressure appear to be at higher risk. It's easy to imagine why those with heart disease are at higher risk from crashing from COVID-19. Even without direct heart damage, lung infections could put a tremendous strain on the heart. Up to 30% of patients hospitalized for regular pneumonia develop cardiovascular complications. About 1 in 35 suffer cardiac arrest, and those who don't are still at 4 times higher risk of a heart attack or stroke within the first 30 days after being released from the hospital. OK, but why is just having high blood pressure a COVID-19 severity risk factor? Under certain circumstances, those hospitalized for regular pneumonia with hypertension may do even better. Investigators speculated this may be due to the anti-inflammatory effects of a common class of high blood pressure drugs called ACE inhibitors, like lisinopril, for which there are more than 100 million prescriptions dispensed annually in the United States alone, super common drugs. And indeed, people on those drugs not only appeared to be less likely to die of pneumonia, but they seemed less likely to even get pneumonia in the first place. Ironically, this same reason why those with hypertension may be protected from regular pneumonia may also be the reason why those with hypertension are at greater risk from COVID-19. ACE inhibitor drugs may be anti-inflammatory, but they may also upregulate the expression of ACE2, which, as you remember, is the enzyme the COVID-19 virus spike protein latches onto in our lungs to infect our cells and spread. So perhaps the reason those with hypertension seem to do worse is that so many of them are on this class of drugs, which may be making them more susceptible to viral attack. ACE2 expression is increased in some of these comorbid conditions, but the drug connection has yet to be verified. So more evidence is urgently needed to confirm the relation, if any, between these high blood pressure drugs and COVID-19. In the meanwhile, here's a flowchart that can help guide your doctor. Should we be holding all the ACEs? Certainly those on these drugs for heart failure or severe or uncontrolled hypertension should continue on these drugs. And when ICUs are overwhelmed, definitely not the time to have a stroke. However, the majority of people taking these drugs do so for treating well-managed mild hypertension, and for these patients, physicians may want to consider temporarily discontinuing them for those at high risk of contracting COVID-19 until we know more. As always, you should never just change or stop taking medications on your own without guidance from your prescribing practitioner. Those of you who follow me on social media know that early on I recommended that people consider not taking ibuprofen unnecessarily, as it's another drug thought to boost ACE2 expression. While the concern again remains theoretical, no drug is completely benign. NSAID drugs like ibuprofen cause intestinal lining damage in as many as 80% of users, for example. So no drug should be taken unnecessarily. Furthermore, NSAID use, ibuprofen use, is strongly advised against in lower respiratory tract infections, as it's been associated with higher complication rates in both children and adults with pneumonia. In fact, fever may actually be beneficial in COVID-19 and probably shouldn't be routinely treated by any means. If you have a fever, cool compresses to the face can make you feel better without dousing your internal high temperature, which may be helping fight off the infection. Having said all that, those prescribed low-dose aspirin for cardiovascular disease should continue to take it. To bring this full circle, the ACE2 connection may also offer some insight into the inconsistent findings between current and past smokers. Nicotine may downregulate ACE2, so while it's always a good idea to quit smoking, this may explain why active smokers may or may not necessarily be at significantly higher risk of COVID-19 progression. Reversing your type 2 diabetes may help, as those with diabetes may suffer a more severe course. The same was true for past deadly coronavirus outbreaks, SARS, and MERS, the Middle East respiratory syndrome. In this regard, the virus has relentlessly highlighted our global Achilles heel of metabolic dysfunction, but also points to a prime opportunity to fight back. That fight, however, is not going to be won only with Clorox, Purell masks, or anti-inflammatory drugs. The fight will only be won through a serious commitment to improving everyone's foundational metabolic health, starting with the lowest-hanging evidence-based fruit dietary and lifestyle interventions. In other words, consuming fresh, fiber-rich whole foods could serve to mitigate some of the overwhelming pro-inflammatory immune response that appears to be compounded in patients with COVID-19 who have diabetes and obesity, and must be a central focus included in any clinical recommendations made to patients or healthcare systems during this pandemic. Excess body fat alone seems to be a risk factor independent of diabetes. Those with severe obesity, weighing more than 215 pounds at the average American's height of 5'6", have 7 times the odds of ending up on a ventilator. But even just being overweight puts you at risk. Those with a body mass index of 28 or more, about 175 pounds at the average height, appear to be at nearly 6 times the odds of suffering a severe COVID-19 course. So BMI of 28 or more puts you at more than 5 times the risk, and the average BMI in the United States is over 29. So we're not talking about obese, just being overweight. Skinnier, in fact, than the average American may put you at significantly higher risk. The excess risk from the excess body fat may arise from greater systemic inflammation, fat covering the heart itself, or the restriction of breathing caused by excessive fatty tissue in the upper body. Even without taking weight into account, though, sadly, most American adults over the age of 50 suffer from a comorbidity that may put them at risk, such as heart disease, lung disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, or cancer. I know I have my infectious diseases hat on right now, rather than my lifestyle medicine hat, but I can't allow to pass without comment that the major comorbid conditions for COVID-19 severity and death, obesity, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease, all can be controlled or even reversed with a healthy enough diet centered around whole plant foods. Thus, in terms of the impact of nutrition, now more than ever, wider access to healthy food should be a top priority, and individuals should be mindful of healthy eating habits to reduce susceptibility to and long-term complications from COVID-19. Not all risk factors are modifiable, though. Advanced age is also a key risk factor for COVID-19 progression and death. Although the disease has afflicted newborns only a few days old through seniors in their 90s, most patients, around 90% in one large case series, are between 30 and 79. The severity of disease, however, disproportionately affects older individuals. In China, the average age of those requiring intensive care was 62, compared to the non-ICU cases, which had an average age of 46. In the United States, even those 65 and older without underlying conditions or other risk factors appear to be hospitalized or end up in the ICU at approximately 3 times the rate of those 19 through 64. Though the media has capitalized on stories of young, healthy individuals suffering severe or even fatal outcomes, people under 65 without known underlying predisposing conditions may only account for about 1% of COVID-19 deaths. South Korea has some of the best data because they did such widespread testing. As you can see, of confirmed cases, only about 1 in 1,000 died in their 30s and 40s. So if you're healthy in your 30s and 40s, only about 1 in 1,000 chance of dying. But for those in their 50s, that rises to closer to 1 in 200. Those in their 60s, about 1 in 50 die. Those in their 70s, it's closer to 1 in 14, and in their 80s, nearly 1 in 5 lost their lives to COVID-19. Though the relative lack of testing makes U.S. data less reliable, based on the first few thousands of American cases, those age-related death risks are similar, as you can see. Note, those are percentages. Lots more younger people are getting infected, so if you look at the absolute numbers, you can see a big chunk of people are getting hospitalized and sent to the ICU in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Lots of younger and middle-aged folks are suffering significant illness. But the vulnerability of our seniors to the pandemic was exemplified by ground zero of the first major U.S. outbreak, a nursing home in Washington state. Of the home's 130 or so residents, 101 became infected, and a third lost their lives.
Are there immune-boosting foods we should be eating in the meanwhile? The next video is a reality check on the immune system and COVID-19 treatment.
Though there are more than 400 clinical treatment trials underway, currently there is no specific proven therapy for COVID-19, and we should not expect a vaccine or effective antiviral drug to be available anytime soon. Although we are developing COVID-19 vaccines at pandemic speed, just for reference, the average vaccine takes more than a decade to develop, with an average failure rate of 94%. Many have asked me for advice on what they can eat to help bolster their immune system. How Not to Die from Infections is, after all, the title of Chapter 5 of my book, How Not to Die. And I do have more than 100 free videos online at NutritionFacts.org that reference immune function. And there are amazing studies, like randomized, double-blind trials showing, for example, that eating broccoli sprouts can reduce viral loads for influenza, decrease virus-induced inflammation, and boost our antiviral natural killer cell activity just from eating some broccoli sprouts. But this isn't the flu. I certainly support general, common-sense advice to stay healthy during the crisis, put forth by trusted authorities such as the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. This includes getting sufficient sleep, 7 to 9 hours, keeping active, reducing stress, staying connected, albeit remotely, to friends and family, and eating healthfully, a diet centered around whole plant foods. The World Health Organization agrees fruits, vegetables, legumes like beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils, nuts, whole grains, cutting down on sugars, cutting down on meat, dairy, and junk, and cutting down on salt. Optimal nutritional status for a well-functioning immune system is an important factor to protect against viral infections. However, one must resist the urge to jump on the snake-oily spam wagon of foods to boost your immune system, given our near-total ignorance of the immunological aspects of this new disease, because enhancing specific arms of the immune system could hypothetically even make things worse. Let me explain. Take the example of this married couple, both same age, admitted to the hospital on the same day for the same COVID-19 infection, fever, shortness of breath. Tragically, the wife was immunocompromised because she was on chemo for breast cancer at the time. Yikes! Whereas her husband had an intact immune system. The wife did fine, though, out of the hospital in under a week, whereas the husband ended up in intensive care. Wait, the immunocompromised patient did better? How is that possible? Well, because unlike other common viruses, coronaviruses have not shown to cause a more severe disease in immunosuppressed patients. Why? Because your own immune response appears to be the main driver of lung tissue damage during infection. Starting around the second week of symptoms, the virus can trigger what's called a cytokine storm. It's like an autoimmune reaction where your body overreacts, and in attacking coronavirus, your lungs get caught in the crossfire. In the first week of the illness, it's the virus itself that's triggering most of your symptoms. But then in severe cases, it's our own inflammatory response that takes over in causing most of the damage. It's striking that many of our innate immune signaling pathways, these cytokine chemical messengers our immune cells release, is aimed at killing off our own cells. But that makes total sense. The virus turns our own cells against us into little virus factories, so it's part of our own antiviral defense to kill off our own cells to dead-end viral replication. Viruses can't replicate in dead cells, so cell suicide is like a way to create fire breaks. But in burning down the village in order to save it, we may not survive the process. This has led some to consider immunosuppression as a treatment for severe COVID-19, but of course immunosuppression for hyperinflammation in COVID-19 might be a double-edged sword. So when you see broccoli sprouts can whip up natural killer cell activity within 2 days, is that a good thing or a bad thing for something like COVID-19? I mean, it was good for seasonal flu, but who knows with this new coronavirus? Young children have relatively immature immune systems and normally suffer disproportionately from viral infections such as the flu, but not, apparently, from COVID-19, or SARS, or MERS, for that matter, the other two deadly coronaviruses. It's interesting. One theory as to why children seem protected suggests that greater pre-existing exposure to common cold coronaviruses offer kids some cross-protection against the new virus. But ironically, a competing theory suggests it's their lack of exposure to similar viruses that's safeguarding them. There's a phenomenon known as ADE, antibody-dependent enhancement, a phenomenon first described more than 50 years ago. In most cases, the antibodies our bodies make to target pathogens neutralizes them, or at the very least, tags the invaders for removal. Sometimes, though, antibodies can actually facilitate viral infection and exacerbate disease. This may be the case with SARS, where antibodies generated against the viral spike proteins were sometimes found to promote infection. In monkeys, an experimental SARS vaccine resulted in aggravated lung damage. Now, vaccine developers are well aware of this phenomenon and would work to ensure any commercial vaccine would be free from this failing, but it has been used to venture a guess to account for the unusual age distribution of severe COVID-19 cases. Perhaps similar coronaviruses circulated silently decades ago, and those old enough to have been exposed to them are now experiencing exaggerated responses to COVID-19. But young people never saw them, so they don't get the overreaction. I'm not suggesting this speculation is true. I just use it to illustrate the complexity of our immune interactions. Viruses attack, we counterattack, and then viruses sometimes evolve to use our own counterattack in their favor. Just a word of caution before trying to specifically boost some element of our immune system before understanding the full scope of the new threat. Given the uncertainties, the best strategy is to not get infected in the first place, especially not until effective treatments and a functioning healthcare system are available.
All right, now there was one thing I did a deep dive into, given its antiviral activity in other contexts. The title of the next video is, Would Zinc Lozenges Help with COVID-19?
Given the current pandemic, the search for potential preventive and therapeutic antiviral strategies is of particular and urgent interest. So what about zinc, which is known in some cases to have antiviral and anti-inflammatory benefits? I looked into it as a potential treatment after the fact-checking site Snopes validated that a noted virologist did indeed make a recommendation back in February to stock up now with zinc lozenges. He based his supposition on the efficacy of zinc for common colds, up to 29% of which are caused by coronaviruses. There's actually a sweet backstory to that. A 3-year-old girl undergoing chemotherapy for leukemia, a disease marked by low zinc levels, refused to swallow a zinc supplement. Immunosuppressed, she had just started getting a cold. Instead of swallowing the supplement, she just let it dissolve in her mouth, and the cold seemed to disappear within hours. Okay, cute little anecdote, but this observation led her father, her own father, to conduct the first randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial on zinc lozenges for the common cold. That's how it all started, but there have since been more than a dozen randomized controlled trials published, and overall, researchers have found that zinc is indeed beneficial in reducing both duration and severity of the common cold when taken within the first 24 hours of symptom onset. Zinc lozenges appear to shorten colds by about 3 days, with significant reductions in nasal discharge, and congestion, and hoarseness, and cough. The common cold results for zinc are often described as mixed, but that appears to be because some studies use zinc lozenges containing added ingredients like citric acid that strongly sequester zinc, so little or no free zinc is actually released. They taste better, but what's the point if you don't actually get the zinc? So what's the best way to take zinc for the common cold? Lozenges containing around 10 to 15 milligrams of zinc, taken every 2 waking hours for a few days, starting immediately upon symptom onset, as either zinc acetate or zinc gluconate, without zinc binders, such as citric acid, tartaric acid, glycine sorbitol, or mannitol, may work best. Best for the common cold, but what about for COVID-19? There are a number of purported mechanisms for the potential protection afforded by zinc. The first is that it interferes with the attachment of rhinoviruses, the most common cause of the common cold, to our cells. This presumably wouldn't help us in the case of COVID-19, since our new coronavirus utilizes a different docking receptor. Zinc also appears to slow rhinovirus replication, at least in a petri dish. What about coronaviruses? Zinc inhibits the coronavirus that causes SARS by interfering with the virus's ability to replicate its genetic code. But that was in conjunction with a chemical that ferried zinc inside the cells. There are natural dietary compounds that may play a similar function, but even if viral replication were able to be slowed in your throat where the lozenge is, what we care about most is stopping replication of the COVID-19 virus in the lungs. But a third mechanism by which zinc may help seems more promising: boosting our antiviral immunity. For example, giving zinc pills to children with severe regular pneumonia has been shown to be effective in reducing mortality, as much as threefold over placebo, 3 times higher death rates in the sugar pill group. But these studies were done in countries like Uganda, India, and Ecuador, where there may have been pre-existing zinc deficiencies. So yeah, taking zinc if you're zinc deficient, no wonder that helps, but it's unclear if similar benefits could be had in higher-income countries with better population-wide micronutrient status. Some have suggested that, despite the lack of clinical data, no one has yet put zinc to the test for COVID-19. Maybe it could help. I'm skeptical it would be helpful in well-nourished individuals, but if taken as directed, it shouldn't hurt, though zinc supplements and lozenges can cause nausea, especially when taken on an empty stomach, and some other gastrointestinal symptoms. And one should never put zinc in their nose. In the drugstore, you'll find all sorts of intranasal zinc gels, sprays, and swabs that have been linked to the potentially permanent loss of one's sense of smell. Oh, and happy ending, that 3-year-old girl beat the cancer, never relapsed, and grew up to become a scientist herself.
The next video is how to avoid COVID-19. You can't get the virus unless the virus can get to you. How long does the virus last on surfaces like paper? How airborne is it exactly? And yes, how fartborne is it? Let's hold our nose and find out.
The best way to survive COVID-19 is not to get it in the first place. Governments can only do so much. Preliminary evidence from Japan suggests the cancellation of events, gatherings, and meetings may slow the spread of COVID-19 by as much as 35%, but that has not been enough to contain the outbreak. During the unbridled phase of a pandemic, the best thing we can do is shelter in place, staying home to reduce contact with those outside our households as much as possible. It's something non-essential workers can all do. Put simply, the American Journal of Emergency Medicine, staying home saves lives. This is how social distancing works. Instead of a scenario like this, you start breaking some of these exponential chains of transmission, so one person staying at home can have a huge effect. And you can't just wait until you hear it's in your area. I grew up in Wyoming, which months in only had a few hundred confirmed cases in the whole state. But by the time a single death occurs in your community, hundreds or even thousands of cases are likely present. We just haven't done the testing. So unless you're on some remote desert island somewhere, a remote desert island with good internet if you're watching this, well, then you should just assume the virus is in your neighborhood wherever you live. Those of us who need to leave our homes to provide essential services, from direct care to food delivery, should strive to keep a safe distance from others, and sufficiently sanitize our hands every time we touch a public surface before we touch our mucous membranes, meaning our eyes or the inside of our nose or mouth. This is good social distancing. This, not so much. Once the pandemic is more under control, ample testing is in place, and the healthcare system is no longer overrun, these social distancing precautions may start to be relaxed, at least for less vulnerable individuals. The good news is you can't infect others if you're not infected yourself, and you can't get the virus unless the virus can get to you. The COVID-19 coronavirus is thought to be transmitted from one person to the next via respiratory droplets coughed out by the infected, propelled through the air, and then landing up the nose, in the mouth, or perhaps even on the eyes of a person nearby. As a sign in 1918 put it, spit spreads death. Indirect avenues of spread involved infecting yourself by touching your eyes, nose, or mouth with hands contaminated by a virus-laden object or surface, such as rubbing your eyes or picking your nose after shaking someone's hand, or touching a public surface like an elevator button, handrail, gas pump, or toilet handle. The levels of virus swarming in the snot of COVID-19 sufferers can reach close to 1 million per drop, which explains how easy it is for them to so thoroughly contaminate their surrounding environment. The presence of the COVID-19 coronavirus in stool samples for up to weeks after infection — in fact, sometimes you can have a negative throat swab but a positive anal swab — suggests another way toilets may potentially transmit infection. As you may remember from my Why You Need to Disinfect Your Toothbrush with White Vinegar video, modern flush toilets aerosolize a plume of up to 145,000 droplets of toilet water into the air, which can remain floating around for at least 30 minutes. This may be one of the ways poliovirus is transmitted. So put a lid on it. Close the lid before you flush, and then, of course, thoroughly wash your hands. The presence of the coronavirus in feces is also why the Oregon State Health Authority recommended people press pause on their peach emoji, and why the New York Post asked if coronavirus could be spread through farts, suggesting flatulence may be an aerosol-generating procedure, something I was surprised to see was actually put to the test. It all started with an inquiry from a nurse. She wanted to know if she was contaminating the sterile environment of the operating room. Investigators were determined to find out. A colleague was asked to toot onto 2 Petri dishes, either fully clothed or with trousers down, and only the bare-bottom fart sprouted bacteria, suggesting that clothing acts as a filter. Pants are like a mask for your butt, both for the gut bacteria and the splattering they found of skin bacteria, thought to be blown from the cheeks by the sheer velocity of it all. Their final conclusion: don't fart naked near food, or at least within 2 inches of food. Similar advice was given in the New York Post piece advising people to throw caution to the wind. Whole nother meaning to silent but deadly. Coughed virus may make it more than 2 inches, though, which is why it's safer to get groceries delivered than to go shopping yourself. During the SARS outbreak, traces of the virus were not only found on items handled directly by patients, like TV remote controls, and surfaces touched by those who interacted with the patients, like the refrigerator door at the nurse's station, but also floating in air samples taken from an infected patient's hospital room, suggesting the possibility of more robust airborne transmission than just coughed droplets. A similar study performed in a COVID-19 patient's hospital room found the virus on a majority of sampled surfaces, but all the air samples were negative. Since then, though, we've learned differently. Studies performed at the Nebraska Biocontainment Unit and the National Quarantine Unit found the majority of air samples tested positive for traces of the virus, even in the hallways outside of patients' rooms. However, the researchers were unable to verify if the airborne virus was infectious, given the extremely low concentration, less than 100 copies per cubic foot of air. Nevertheless, because we know the virus can remain viable for hours when experimentally misted into the air, special care should be certainly taken for healthcare workers during aerosol-generating medical procedures. How long does the virus last on contaminated surfaces? You may have heard that coronaviruses, like flu viruses, are enveloped viruses. Enveloped in what? As coronaviruses, shown here in yellow, bud out of infected cells, shown here in blue, they cloak themselves in the outer layer of our cells. They're wrapped in a stolen swath of our own cell membranes. That oily coating helps them hide from immune surveillance because it looks like us, but it also makes them susceptible to disinfection and environmental inactivation. Non-enveloped viruses, like polio, can last for weeks outside the body, whereas enveloped viruses tend to only be able to survive for days. As enveloped viruses go, though, coronaviruses tend to be relatively resistant. There's a coronavirus that infects pigs, for example, that can last for a month on non-porous surfaces like metal, plastic, or glass, but at most, human coronaviruses only make it about a week. On copper and brass, coronaviruses may not be able to survive more than a few minutes at low levels of contamination and a few hours at higher doses. But different coronaviruses have different environmental stability. The SARS coronavirus lasted more than 6 days dried on plastic, whereas one of the common cold coronaviruses didn't even make it 3 days. The SARS virus lasts up to 4 days in water or soil, but survive for just minutes after drying on paper when lightly soiled, or up to a day when heavily contaminated, and less than an hour on cotton cloth. But what about SARS-2, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19? The COVID-19 virus appears to be more stable on paper than the SARS virus, with infectivity extinguished only after 24 hours at the same viral load that led to SARS to become inactive after 8 hours. The half-life of the COVID-19 virus on steel or plastic is about 6 hours, so about 99% is gone by 48 hours, but it may take as long as 96 hours for all infectivity to disappear. On cloth, the COVID-19 virus may only last for 1 day, but on the outer layer of surgical masks, it can survive for at least a full week. On printing paper, though, the COVID-19 virus appears to survive for less than 3 hours. The virus can only infect you, however, if it can get inside you. Having the virus on your fingers is only a problem if you then inoculate yourself by transferring that virus to your eyes, nose, or mouth. It's funny when they do experiments for like the common cold to see if transmission is more through the air or through touch. They put people in these crazy arm braces where they can't bend their elbow, ensuring that they never touch their face. Having the virus on your fingers is only a problem if you then inoculate yourself by transferring that virus to your eyes, nose, or mouth. It's not your face in general. Touching your forehead, cheek, or chin is presumably no more dangerous than touching your elbow. The virus can't pass through your skin. The virus can only replicate in live cells, and the outer layer of your skin is covered by protective strata of dead skin cells. To get into your lungs, the virus has to find its way to your mucous membranes, the moist lining of your eyes, nostrils, or mouth. The reason your nose starts to run when you cry is that tears drain through tiny channels that tunnel through the nasal bone and spill into your nostrils, and viruses in your eye can travel the same route to get to your lungs. As long as you don't touch your face, why does it matter if surfaces are contaminated? Because you do touch your face. The oft-repeated 23 times an hour statistic is an overestimate, since of the touches recorded in the cited study on university students, most were just to the skin on the face, but 10 touches an hour were to the eyes, nose, or mouth. Adults videotaped in an office-type setting did worse, each touching their nostrils, eyes, or lips, an average of nearly 16 times an hour. What about doctors? Medical professionals were covertly observed during a grand rounds lecture at a hospital, and about 1 out of every 3 subjects picked their nose at least once. In family medicine offices, clinicians and staff touched their eyes, nose, or mouth an average of 19 times in 2 hours, with a range from 0 to over 100 touches. More concerning in terms of patient safety, however, was the finding that doctors only wash their hands about 30% of the times they should, even in intensive care units. And even when they did manage to wash their hands, it was for an average of less than 9 seconds.
Ready for some recipes? Unfortunately, not those kind of recipes, but rather recipes for my DIY hand sanitizer and surface disinfectant. But hey, at least there's no sourdough starter required. The next video is hand washing and sanitizing to inactivate the COVID-19 coronavirus.
Because it's so difficult for people to keep themselves from unconsciously touching their face, it's critical to be able to disinfect your hands by washing your hands with soap and water, sudsing up for at least 20 seconds. It's not clear why the CDC chose that duration. There is evidence that if you have bacteria-contaminated meat debris on your hands, washing with soap for 20 seconds is preferable to without soap for 5 seconds. Duh. But most of the published soap-to-soap studies compared 15 seconds to 30 seconds, and have found there does not appear to be a meaningful difference between 15 and 30. The recommendation to wash your hands with soap and water for 20 seconds was likely made to encourage sufficient hand coverage. Using invisible fluorescent or UV dyes, researchers have found the most frequently missed areas when washing your hands include the fingertips, thumbs, and backs of hands. So it's good to get into a habit of going through all the steps to cover all the surfaces instead of just happy birthdaying your way through the same motions. Makes the time go a little faster if you have a routine down. And artificial nails are discouraged, as they've been shown to interfere with hand-washing efficacy. Should you use hot water for hand washing? When I gave a webinar on this topic and asked people to vote, about 1,000 out of the 5,000 participants got it wrong. Contrary to popular belief, there is no need to use hot water. Studies going back more than 80 years show no benefit in germ removal when using hot water over cool water, and frequent hand washing with hot water may increase the risk of skin irritation. And as an aside, the false belief that warm or hot water is preferable may also add an additional million metric tons of carbon through energy usage to the atmosphere from the United States alone every year. The use of hand lotions or creams has been shown to help protect hands from the minor skin damage associated with frequent hand washing at any temperature. Now, for healthcare professionals, the World Health Organization recommends the use of alcohol-based hand sanitizer, whether gel, foam, or spray, over hand washing for routine hand disinfection, that is, when hands are not visibly soiled, and so does the CDC. What type of hand hygiene is recommended? The CDC continues to recommend the use of alcohol-based hand rubs as the primary method for hand hygiene. Why? Part of the reason is greater compliance compared to hand washing with soap and water. Just as we can't rely on people to not touch their face, we can't rely on people to wash their hands properly. In a family medicine clinic, fewer than 1 in 10 hand washings met even a 10-second version of the CDC standards, less than 10%. In contrast, more than 8 out of 10 instances of disinfections with alcohol-based cleansers hit the mark, which simply entails rubbing your hands together until the alcohol covers all surfaces of the hands, and then waiting for the product to dry completely. Normally cheap and ubiquitous at dollar stores everywhere, hand sanitizer was one of the first items to disappear from store shelves and internet inventories as the COVID-19 crisis loomed. Anyone heeding my decade-old advice on pandemic preparedness to stock up should already be well supplied, but if not, you can make your own. Although 40% alcohol, either ethanol, regular drinking alcohol, or isopropyl, found in rubbing alcohol, has been found to topically kill some envelope viruses like SARS or MERS. Others, like hepatitis C and Ebola virus, require 60% alcohol or more, as measured on a volume rather than weight basis. That's why recommended alcohol concentrations in hand sanitizers range from a minimum of 60%, recommended by the CDC, to 75 or 80% recommended by the WHO, because they want to account for a wide variety of pathogens. But what do we need specifically for COVID-19? On Snopes, the social media meme that a handmade hand sanitizer made with Tito's vodka can be used to fight the new coronavirus was ruled as false, since most vodkas, including Tito's, only contain 40% alcohol, and Snopes cited the CDC's 60% minimum rule. However, the CDC has since published evidence by a respected team of researchers funded by the European Commission and German government, finding that the COVID-19 virus could be inactivated within 30 seconds by just 30% alcohol, either ethyl alcohol or isopropyl alcohol. So like 30% alcohol, 70% water, wiped out the COVID-19 coronavirus. In that case, a variety of hard liquors or spirits could indeed be repurposed for use as hand sanitizers for COVID-19, either straight or even diluted to a certain extent. Most vodka, rum, brandy, tequila, gin, and whiskey exceed 30% alcohol by volume. So from a COVID-19 standpoint, there are still bottles of hand sanitizer available on the shelves, just on those of liquor stores rather than drugstores. It's funny, past guests in my home are surprised to see so many big plastic bottles of cheap 120-proof vodka in my wine rack, especially for someone who doesn't drink at all. I stocked up a decade ago, following my own pandemic prep guidelines to make some extra DIY budget-friendly hand sanitizer for the next outbreak. And with the current virus, it looks like I may be even able to cut it 50-50. Note that 30% alcohol isn't enough to kill many other pathogens, so I'd still recommend 60 to 80% alcohol products if you can get them, so you can have one rub to rule them all. But in a pinch, during this crisis, it can be comforting to know that there may be some alternatives. Both the WHO and interim FDA guidelines for those making their own hand sanitizer include the use of an emollient, 1.5% by volume glycerol, also known as glycerin, to help keep the alcohol from drying the skin, as well as a preservative, 0.125% by volume of the standard over-the-counter 3% hydrogen peroxide, to kill any contaminating bacterial spores. What's important for inactivating the virus, though, is the alcohol content. So here's the recipe for making a gallon. Assuming 30% alcohol is sufficient and you had all the ingredients, you can make a gallon of COVID-19 hand sanitizer by combining 12 cups of an 80-proof liquor with a quarter cup of glycerin, which is also spelled glycerin with an E, or glycerol, and a teaspoon of regular strength hydrogen peroxide, and then just fill the rest of a gallon container up with water, and nothing else. The addition of a gelling agent such as aloe vera is not recommended, as it might compromise antiviral efficacy. You could also quarter the recipe to make a quart, 3 cups spirits, a tablespoon glycerin, quarter teaspoon hydrogen peroxide, and water. But no need to get so fancy for this particular virus. The easiest method would probably be to just use the 80-proof liquor straight up as a hand sanitizing rub. Just pour it into a squirt or spray bottle in a apply enough to completely cover all surfaces of your hands, and then rub together for 30 seconds until they're dry. On inanimate surfaces, bleach is recommended for disinfection, 1 part household bleach diluted in 49 parts water, so about 1 teaspoon bleach per cup of water, and nothing else. Never mix bleach with any other cleanser. Bleach reacts with ammonia, found in many glass cleaners, to create hazardous gases called chloramines, and reacts with acids like vinegar or some toilet bowl and drain cleaners and automatic dishwashing detergents to create chlorine gas, which is also toxic. Note the more typical 1 to 100 dilution of bleach, as sometimes recommended by the manufacturer on the back of the bottle, may not be sufficient based on data from other coronaviruses. That's why it seems more appropriate to recommend a dilution of 1 to 50 of standard bleach in the coronavirus setting. Note that 1 to 50 is for standard bleach, meaning 5% sodium hypochlorite. You can read the label. If you have 2.5% hypochlorite bleach, you'd have to use 2 teaspoons per cup, and if you have 10% hypochlorite bleach, you'd only need a half teaspoon per cup. The bleach solution can be used within a month of preparation if stored in a closed, opaque container at room temperature, though it's recommended that you leave it on the surface you're disinfecting for at least 10 minutes. When put to the test, 5 minutes of that concentration was found to wipe out the COVID virus. Note that surfaces grossly contaminated by bodily secretions, meaning visibly contaminated with snot or blood or poop, may require a stronger bleach solution. 1 part standard bleach to 9 parts water left for 10 minutes. So that would be like 5 teaspoons of bleach for inanimate surfaces that are visibly contaminated with bodily fluids per cup of water. Alcohol can be used on surfaces that aren't suitable for bleach, such as metal, which bleach can stain or even corrode. Sufficiently concentrated povidone iodine, chloroxylenol, chlorhexidine also have been shown to clear the virus within 5 minutes. Although the EPA suggests common quaternary ammonium compounds should be effective, I found an old paper that reported they were virtually useless as a sole disinfectant agent against viruses dried on surfaces, including one of the common cold human coronaviruses. Though when put to the test, a 0.1% solution of benzalkonium chloride has been found to be effective against SARS-CoV-2 within 5 minutes. But just a straight soap solution, 1 part hand soap, 49 parts water, appeared to take as long as 15 minutes to inactivate it. That would be 1 teaspoon liquid hand soap and a cup of water. Dishwashing detergent appears to work faster, at least against the SARS virus, with the same 1 to 50 dilution of dish soap to water working within 5 minutes. No word yet on dish soap and the SARS-2 coronavirus. Within 30 seconds, Lysol disinfectant spray and a 1 to 64 dilution of Pine Sol destroy murine hepatitis virus, a mouse coronavirus that's used as a potential surrogate for human coronaviruses, since it's safer to handle in the lab than something like SARS. But Lysol and Pine Sol have yet to be tested against the COVID-19 virus. In a pinch, wine vinegar, 6% acid, was shown to destroy more than 99.9% of SARS virus within 60 seconds, but again, no word on the new virus. The most macabre decontamination advice I found was published in the Journal of the Chinese Medical Association. Corpses should be burned or buried deep.
I hope you have been hydrating. It's time for another quick 5-minute break before we continue. I hope everyone is refreshed for the second half, the thrilling conclusion of the pandemic webinar. Next, I'm going to cover what to do if you come down with COVID-19, along with a discussion of whether pets like cats and dogs can be infected and infectious. Oh, hold on, gotta share. There we go.
Ideally, once you become infected, you would be safely quarantined away from your family in a so-called fever clinic, a dedicated facility designed to assess, test, treat, and triage patients so you wouldn't put the people you live with at risk. Fever clinics were one of the strategies used to bring the outbreak in China under control by preventing clusters of family infections. In lieu of such innovations, the best choice is try to recover at home, isolated as much as possible from your housemates. Preferably, you should avoid contact with both people and pets, and be cordoned off in a sick room with a separate bathroom if possible. Can pets get the disease? In rare cases, dogs have been found infected with the new coronavirus, but the virus replicates poorly in canines. They don't seem to get sick, and they don't appear to pass the virus along to others. This is consistent with what we saw in SARS, where a small number of pets tested positive, but they didn't appear able to infect others. The COVID-19 virus has been shown to reproduce efficiently in cats, however, who are then able to experimentally transmit the virus to other cats in separate cages, presumably via respiratory droplets, even though they may themselves not become sick. A survey of 102 cats in Wuhan province after the outbreak found evidence of infection in 15 of them, presumed, as with the pet dogs, to be cases of human-to-animal transmission. In the United States, the first confirmed case of animal infection was a sickened tiger at the Bronx Zoo, followed by a few pet cats. There is no evidence to date that pets have been a source of infection of COVID-19 for humans, but rather we suspect it's the other way around. To reduce the risk of spreading the disease to those you live with, if you are sick, cover your nose and mouth with a tissue when you cough or sneeze, throw the used tissue in a lined trash can, and then immediately sanitize your hands. Don't share personal household items such as eating utensils, towels, or bedding. Wash your hands often. Routinely disinfect all high-touch objects such as phones, doorknobs, and toilet surfaces in your sick room and bathroom yourself, and have someone else clean and disinfect the rest of the house if possible. Harvard public health experts suggest running the exhaust fan in the bathroom. Opening the windows in the sick room to enhance ventilation may also help. During the SARS outbreak, hospital wards with larger ventilation windows appeared to harbor significantly lower infection risk for healthcare workers. And finally, based on surrogate coronaviruses, using a humidifier if the air is dry may also cut down on the viral circulation. Most people who contract COVID-19 spontaneously recover without the need for medical intervention. If you do come down with it, protect those around you, get rest, stay hydrated, and monitor your symptoms. If serious problems arise, such as difficulty breathing or persistent pain or pressure in the chest, seek medical attention. But notify the 911 operator that you may have the virus, or if less serious, call your doctor or emergency room first before heading in, since they may have special instructions for suspect cases in your area. The CDC advises that once your symptoms start getting better, once you've been fever-free for 3 full days off of fever-reducing medications, and it's been at least a full week since your symptoms first started, then you can start relaxing your home isolation. The World Health Organization is more conservative, however, recommending self-quarantine for a full 14 days for anyone with symptoms or anyone living with anyone with symptoms. If you're sick and you must be in the same room with someone else, you should wear a face mask. That's what masks were originally designed for, so-called source control rather than self-protection. They're meant to protect others from you rather than you from others. Common cold coronaviruses, as well as flu and rhinoviruses, can be detected in exhaled breath, not just coughing and sneezing. And surgical masks can cut down on the amount of virus you exhale out into the world. We have yet to know if this is true of COVID-19, but the head of the Standing Committee on Emerging Infectious Diseases at the National Academy of Sciences told the White House currently available research supports the possibility that SARS-CoV-2 could be spread via bioaerosols generated directly by patients' exhalation. This shouldn't be surprising. After all, respiratory droplets are not just sneezed gobs of mucus. When your breath fogs when you're outside on a really cold day, that's an illustration of respiratory droplets. That plume of vapor coming out of your mouth is made up of tiny droplets of water straight from your lungs. On a warm day, you can imagine yourself breathing out that same cloud, you just can't see it. Err on the side of caution and assume the virus is in the breath. If infected individuals are exhaling virus before they even know they have it, maybe everyone should be covering their face in public. The CDC initially resisted such a measure, a decision the Director General of the Chinese CDC referred to as a big mistake. The U.S. CDC relented in April, recommending wearing cloth face coverings in public settings where other social distancing measures are difficult to maintain, such as grocery stores or pharmacies. The 180-degree shift is probably best exemplified by the U.S. Surgeon General's swing from tweeting, "Seriously, people, stop buying masks," all caps, exclamation point, to being featured in a video weeks later demonstrating how to improvise masks out of a bandana and rubber bands. The CDC has easy no-sew instructions at bit.ly/CDCDIY. In addition, for those who are sick and necessarily exposed to others, surgical masks are advised when disinfecting a residence that may have been exposed to the virus. You should also wear disposable gloves, open all the windows while mopping the floor and cleaning all surfaces with a disinfectant solution, and washing all linens and the clothes you just wore, cleaning with detergent. Make sure to hold soiled linens away from your body and don't shake them before they are washed. And as always, take care to not touch your eyes, nose, and mouth when removing your mask, and carefully wash your hands afterwards. You can find all these instructions at bit.ly/COVID cleaning. The suggestion that the public should not wear masks because healthcare workers need them more is definitely valid up to a point, but it's surely an argument for manufacturing more masks, not denying them to populations who could potentially benefit from them. Until such masks are available in sufficient numbers, though, frequently washed cloth masks are recommended by the CDC. I'll talk about what the best materials to use for them is, as well as the role of N95 respirators, next.
All right, if you have any more questions about the cat and dog data, please remember to click on the Q&A button. As I noted at the end of the video, next up is the best mask or DIY face coverings for COVID-19. 20 different materials are put to the test. There's going to be another one where you may want to go back and pause to really appreciate the data.
Cloth face coverings are no substitute for actual masks, but maybe better than nothing. Let me show you a few studies. This study, testing the efficacy of various homemade masks, found that scarves, pillowcases, and 100% cotton t-shirts were probably the most suitable household materials, blocking various bacteria and viruses, about 60% as well as surgical masks. As you can see, the average filtration efficiency was about 90% or more with surgical masks, compared to more like 50, 60, or 70% for the improvised fabrics. Vacuum cleaner bags worked better, right up there alongside surgical masks, but were considerably harder to breathe through, rendering it unsuitable for a face mask, and the same with tea towels. Engineers at the University of Cambridge looked at 20 different options compared to surgical masks. So you can see, for example, that lightweight T-shirts have less than half the filtration of heavyweight cotton tees. As you can see, windbreakers and denim jeans are right up there comparable to surgical masks alongside the vacuum cleaner bags, but suffer the same problem. They're very difficult to breathe through and are thus ill-suited for face mask construction. Taking that balance between breathing and filtration into account, the most suitable fabrics for face mask construction may include something like cotton flannel, though in a pinch a single sock pressed tight against the nose and mouth might make a good emergency mask substitute. Regardless of which you use, try not to touch the front of the mask while you're wearing it or when you remove it, then wash your hands. And cloth face coverings should be washed regularly. Even though face coverings are intended to protect others from the wearer rather than the wearer from others, masks have been recommended for self-protection during the last pandemic for those at high risk in unavoidably crowded settings. In hospital settings, for example, mask wearers appear to have been comparatively protected from contracting SARS. However, even 3 or 4 layers of cloth in the form of cotton handkerchiefs only filters a fraction of what a simple surgical mask can block. These are penetration numbers, so 4 layers of cotton may only block 4%, 10 times less than a simple surgical mask. Improvised masks didn't seem to help in 1918, attributed to the fact that to get the necessary protective filtration, so many layers of gauze had to be used that breathing was difficult and air leaked around the edges. An improvised face mask should be viewed as the last possible alternative if a supply of commercial face masks is not available. The World Health Organization still doesn't think routine mask wearing in public is necessary, expressing concern that it might lead to a false sense of security and neglect of more important measures such as hand hygiene and social distancing, and may lead to touching one's face. On the other hand, one could imagine how wearing a mask might prompt people to avoid touching their face. Gloves could play a similar role, right? Seeing bright purple gloves on your hands can serve as a constant reminder. Here's me recording the audiobook to How to Survive a Pandemic. Yes, you can still breathe in virus while wearing a mask, and you can still contaminate yourself with gloved fingers, but anything that keeps you constantly conscious about the position of your hands and stops you from touching your face might help. Speaking of self-conscious, if everyone wore masks in public, symptomatic patients who definitely should be wearing them wouldn't fear being singled out for stigma. Of course, universal use of face masks in public during a pandemic could only be considered if supplies permit. Sadly, inadequate preparation, misuse, and hoarding have led to a critical shortage of personal protective gear for those on the front line. That's why the CDC is recommending cloth face coverings instead of surgical masks. Things are getting desperate when an editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association entitled "Sourcing Personal Protective Equipment During the COVID-19 Pandemic" includes as a proposed suggestion coffee filter masks. Surgical masks are usually made out of paper with a gelatinous layer and should be changed every 4 hours or when they become wet with saliva or other fluid, whichever comes first. Surgical masks, as the name implies, are typically meant to protect others, as in the patient opened up on the operating table. N95 masks, or N95 respirators, as they're often called, are the cup-like masks that fit tighter to the face. They are intended to protect the wearer. The WHO and CDC have conflicting guidelines as to what healthcare workers should wear during routine care of patients with COVID-19. The CDC, along with its European counterpart, recommends N95 respirators, whereas the WHO suggests surgical masks are sufficient. While part of the WHO's reluctance to endorse N95s may come out of a sensitivity to the global scarcity of such resources, the underlying transmission dynamics of the COVID-19 virus remain largely unknown, so it's impossible at this time to say which recommendation is right with any certainty. The relative importance of direct respiratory spread for COVID-19 versus indirect contact via contaminated objects is unclear. For other viral respiratory illnesses, like the common cold, breathing appears more important than touching. That's what that arm brace study showed. For example, in one rhinovirus experiment, only 50% of those touching contaminated coffee cup handles became infected. For the flu, the relative importance of transmission continues to be debated, which is remarkable since we've known about the virus for nearly a century. Note that N95 respirators only work at peak efficiency if they conform completely to the face, so they aren't for everyone. Even 1 to 2 days of stubble may significantly undermine the necessary seal. This is an actual infographic from the CDC showing which types of facial hair may or may not be suitable. They also must be used properly. In a laboratory setting, N95 respirators have been found to be very effective, but out in the real world, a review of the best science on preventing the spread of respiratory viruses found no evidence that the more expensive, irritating, and uncomfortable N95 respirators were superior to simple surgical masks. Not that N95s aren't better at filtration, but perhaps due to poor compliance. I remember how uncomfortable they were when I was working with tuberculosis patients. So that would support the WHO recommendation that N95s aren't necessarily better in real-world settings, though with proper fitting and compliance they'd presumably come out on top. Even with the perfect mask sealed over your mouth and nose, your eyes are still exposed, leading to a suggestion that medical workers wear goggles. Monkeys can apparently be infected by dripping the COVID-19 virus into their eyes, but a retrospective study of SARS, at least, found no documented cases of transmission to healthcare workers just because they didn't use eye protection. Until we know more about the transmission of this virus, it would seem prudent for those in close contact with coughing patients to err on the side of caution and use both eye protection, like at least a face shield, and N95 respirators. During the SARS outbreak in North America, regular surgical masks were initially recommended, but the advice switched to respirators after doctors started dying. Here's how N95 masks compare to various cloth face coverings. Note these are graphs of penetration. So you can see for an N95 mask there's less than 5% penetration. So at the particle size at which an N95 mask blocks more than 95%, a mask made out of a t-shirt blocks only about 10%, scarves about 20%, sweatshirts about 30%, and towels closer to 40%. It's interesting that the Hanes t-shirts are no better than any of the other t-shirts, but the Hanes sweatshirts appeared to have an edge for some reason. Of course, the study was funded by Hanes. Just kidding.
All right. Before we look towards future pandemic threats, what should we expect in the coming months and years with SARS-CoV-2? Next up is my video, How COVID-19 Ends: Vaccination, Mutations, and Herd Immunity.
Will COVID-19 just go away naturally as warmer weather approaches? We shouldn't count on it. Though the common cold coronaviruses follow a seasonal pattern like the flu, peaking every winter, there are other respiratory viral infections that peak in the spring or the summer. In fact, MERS coronavirus, the last deadly coronavirus to cause an epidemic, peaked in August in the sweltering heat and blistering sun of the Arabian Peninsula. The mechanisms underlying the seasonality of viral respiratory infections remains a subject of scientific debate. It's likely a combination of factors involving the virus itself, for example, viral viability at different temperatures and humidity, host immunity, such as vitamin D status and the drying of our airways, and host behavior, like the crowding of susceptible individuals indoors. However, the near-universal susceptibility to novel pandemic viruses may supersede these seasonal factors. All the recent flu pandemics emerged in the spring or summer months, though secondary waves did tend to hit during the following winter. Even if the contagiousness of the COVID-19 virus drops this summer in the Northern Hemisphere due to warmer, wetter weather, it is not expected to make a large dent in the pandemic curve. What would stop the pandemic is herd immunity, having a critical portion of the populace immune to the virus. An infection can only burn through a population if there are enough susceptible individuals for the viral sparks to jump from one person to the next. Immune individuals who can't get or transmit the virus act as fire breaks to slow the spread, or like control rods in a nuclear reactor to break the chains of transmission. Ideally, this is accomplished through mass vaccination. Vaccines are a way to fight fire with fire, using the virus to fight the virus by generating the benefits of infection, immunity, without the risks, disease and death. Unfortunately, even though we are now developing vaccines at pandemic speed, it's humbling to realize that the average vaccine takes over 10 years to create and has a 94% chance of failure. Without a vaccine, herd immunity is only achieved the hard way, through mass infection. The proportion of the population that needs to acquire immunity to stop a pandemic can be roughly estimated from the basic reproduction number I talked about before, the number of people a single infected individual tends to go on to infect. The basic equation is P crit equals 1 minus 1 divided by R naught, where R naught is the basic reproduction number, and P crit is what we're looking for, the minimum proportion of a population needed to be vaccinated or have recovered with subsequent immunity to smother an outbreak within that population. So if every COVID-19 case leads to 2 others becoming infected, then half of the population may need to be vaccinated or infected before the pandemic dies down. But if each person on average infects 4 others, then one would need closer to 3/4 of the population to be immune to stop it. This is an overly simplistic model, but offers a ballpark approximation. Based on R naught estimates for the COVID-19 virus from large outbreaks in affected countries, the minimum population immunity required ranges from about 30%, based on South Korea's R naught estimate of 1.43, to more like 80% based on an early R naught estimate from Spain that was closer to 5. That's why it's so important to enact curve-flattening measures like social distancing to reduce the number of contacts and drive the basic reproduction number down as low as possible. You don't want to have to wait until 80% of the population is infected. Of course, this is all working under the assumption that people who recover from COVID-19 acquire immunity to reinfection. It works in rhesus monkeys. Scientists rechallenged 2 recovered monkeys with the COVID-19 virus and were unable to successfully reinfect them. We don't yet have a definitive answer as to whether humans become immune after infection, but the fact that at least a small case series reported potential treatment benefit from convalescent plasma, the transfusion of blood products from a recovered patient, suggests the buildup of at least temporary immunity. We have 3 lines of defense against viral reinfection: circulating antibodies that can neutralize the virus, memory B cells that can create new antibodies upon re-exposure. Memory B cells are the reason people can remain immune from the chickenpox virus for 50 or more years, for example. And thirdly, memory T cells that can help hunt down virus-infected cells. The benefit of convalescent plasma derives from the antibodies, but a 6-year follow-up study of patients recovered from SARS found that about 90% no longer had any detectable anti-SARS antibodies in their bloodstreams. But that's OK, because their memory B cells could just make more, right? Unfortunately, Not a single SARS-specific memory B cell was found in any of the former SARS patients, so it's definitely not something like chickenpox. Now, about 60% were able to mount a memory T cell response, though it's not clear if that alone would be able to protect them from reinfection. Unlike HIV, which keeps parts of itself hidden to evade the immune system and establish a long latent infection, the COVID-19 virus appears to take more of a smash-and-grab approach. It brazenly displays its array of spike proteins in a presumed attempt to better bind to its victim, but counts on jumping ship before immunity develops by quickly being coughed onto a new host. This bodes well for both the post-recovery acquisition of immunity and the prospects of vaccine development. A trait the COVID-19 virus does share with HIV, however, is its rapid mutation rate. One reason RNA viruses like HIV and coronaviruses and all flu viruses represent a higher pandemic threat than those that use DNA as their genetic material is that viral RNA replication can be sloppy. Every copying cycle can result in multitudes of mutants, most of which probably aren't even viable. But the flip side of this intrinsic inefficiency is that rare mutants may arise from this diverse population of variants that come exploding out of each infected cell that are either better adapted to the current host or tailored towards new ones. The high mutation rate of coronaviruses may help explain their proclivity to jump across species barriers in the first place. But the question we face now is what this new virus will do next. The genetic sequences of viral copies recovered from COVID-19 patients around the world have already diverged as much as 15% as different strains spread around the globe. Here's how rapidly the various COVID-19 strains have splayed out across the world in just a few short months. In the SARS epidemic, certain early mutants went on to dominate, which led to the supposition that genetic adaptation to humans was helping to drive the outbreak, but that remains to be substantiated. Though continued mutation of the COVID-19 virus doesn't yet offer insight into the direction of its evolution, we cannot rule out the possibility that the virus could transform to become even more transmissible or dangerous in the near future.
All right, as bad as this pandemic has been, COVID-19 may just be a dress rehearsal for an even deadlier pandemic threat waiting in the wings of chickens. Check it out.
Even with some suppression strategies in place, millions around the world are expected to die in the COVID-19 pandemic. In the United States, a best guess estimate presented to the American Hospital Association was about 500,000 American deaths, with sufficient social distancing that may be reduced around 100,000. Even at 500,000, though, it still unbelievably could be much, much worse. With thousands already dead, millions projected to perish, billions in lockdown, and trillions lost as markets tumble, COVID-19 is still only shaping up to be a Category 2 or 3 pandemic. This is from the CDC's Pandemic Planning Guidelines. The Pandemic Severity Index is fashioned after the Hurricane Severity Index to define the destructive capacity of a storm. Well, this is the CDC's attempt at classifying the destructive capacity of a pandemic. It is based on case fatality ratio, also known as the case fatality rate, the percentage of those who fall ill who eventually succumb to the infection. In the 1918 flu pandemic, about 1 in 3 fell ill, and of those, about 2% died. That made the 1918 pandemic a Category 5, analogous to a super typhoon with sustained winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. The rate of those dying from COVID-19 infection is much lower. If you include those who tested positive that were asymptomatic, it's looking like around the mortality of the last 2 flu pandemics, or a bad seasonal flu season. If you're talking about true cases, people who actually get sick, we're talking closer to the 0.5% cutoff between a Category 2 and Category 3 pandemic, meaning about 1 in 200 cases dying. As you can see, the 2% case fatality, like the 1918 pandemic, is just where Category 5 starts. COVID-19 shows that SARS-like coronaviruses can escape our grasp and spark a full-blown pandemic. SARS was rapidly stamped out by fever-monitoring travelers, but by the time it was all over, there were about 800 deaths out of 8,000 cases. That's a case-fatality ratio of 10%. Thank heavens we're dealing with a pandemic from SARS-CoV-2 and not the original SARS coronavirus. Even more lethal, MERS killed more like 850 out of 2,500, which is a 34% case fatality rate, 1 in 3 chance of dying if you come down with it. Since 2002 with SARS, and then 2012 with MERS, we learned that coronaviruses could become deadly. They're not just the common cold viruses we thought they were. Now, with COVID-19, we realize this family of viruses can also explode unfettered onto the global stage. So coronaviruses have already shown us they can do both. It's not hard to imagine a combination of transmissibility and lethality that makes the next coronavirus pandemic worse by an order of magnitude or more. But there's an even greater cautionary tale to be told, which is the primary subject of my new book. We've long known about the pandemic potential of the flu virus, but the deadliest it ever appeared to get was the 2% fatality of the 1918 influenza. Now, 2% was enough to kill up to 100 million people, making it the single deadliest event in human history, but an even greater threat may be waiting in the wings of a chicken. In 1997, a flu virus was discovered in chickens that would forever change our understanding of how bad pandemics could get. So far, it's remained a disease of poultry, not people, but of the hundreds of rare individuals it has infected, more than half have died. A flu virus with a case fatality rate exceeding 50%. What if a virus like that were to mutate to acquire easy human transmissibility? The last time a bird flu virus jumped directly to humans and caused a pandemic, it triggered the deadliest plague in human history. But what if instead of a 2% death rate, it was more like a flip of the coin? The COVID-19 pandemic is devastating, but food is still being restocked in our grocery stores. The internet may be slow, but it's still up. The lights are still on, and safe drinking water is still flowing from the tap. Doctors and nurses are still showing up to work. If the predictions are correct and only about 100,000 Americans die, that's less than 1 in 3,000. In the pandemic of 1918, in which 2% of the cases succumbed, 1 in 150 Americans died. Imagine if it were 10 times as bad as 2%, with 1 in 15 dying, or 25 times as bad, killing 1 in 6 of us. The good news is there's something we can do about it. Just as eliminating the exotic animal trade and live animal markets may go a long way towards preventing the next coronavirus pandemic, reforming the way we raise domestic animals for food may help forestall the next killer flu. We got off easy in the last pandemic. Swine flu only triggered a Category 1 pandemic in 2009, but it showed a new origin point for pandemic viruses: pork production. It was like epidemiological blowback from our globalizing these intensive confinement methods. The unprecedented emergence of H5N1 and the 10 other new bird flu viruses infecting humans around the world has been blamed on industrial poultry production. When we overcrowd tens of thousands of animals in these cramped, filthy, football field-sized sheds to lie beak to beak atop their own waste, it's just a breeding ground for disease. The sheer numbers of animals, the overcrowding, the stress crippling their immune systems, the ammonia from the decomposing waste burning their lungs, the lack of fresh air, lack of sunlight, put all these factors together, and what you have is really kind of a perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of these so-called superstrains of influenza. That's why the United Nations has urged that governments, local authorities, and international agencies need to take a greatly increased role in combating the role of what they call factory farming, which, combined with these live animal markets, provide ideal conditions for the flu virus to spread and mutate into a more dangerous form. These so-called CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, have vastly altered the evolution of the influenza virus. The H5N1 virus started out, like all bird flu viruses, as harmless, waterborne intestinal infections of waterfowl, but only gained airborne transmission in the ramping up of extreme virulence within massive intensive poultry production. Perhaps only a change in conditions as great as 10 million bird megafarms could account for the dramatic series of mutations sufficient to create such a monster. There also seems to be an acceleration of human influenza problems over the last few decades, involving an increasing number of species, and, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, this is also expected to largely relate to the intensification of the poultry and possibly pig production. Big Ag may be brewing up big flu. For the underlying science, the evolutionary biological mechanisms, allow me to refer you to my invited review I wrote for Critical Reviews in Microbiology, where I lay out all the evidence. It's free, no paywall. Just go to bit.ly/flu review. Currently, the CDC considers the bird flu virus H7N9 to be our gravest threat, the virus with the highest pandemic emergence risk and the highest potential impact. An estimate was published as to what an H7N9 pandemic might look like in the United States, and they concluded millions of Americans dead. So far, H7N9 has killed about 600 of the first 1,500 people it infected. That's around 40%, 2 in 5 people. Thankfully, neither H5N1 nor H7N9 have acquired the capacity for easy human-to-human transmission. But given that both H5 and H7 viruses have displayed the propensity to infect humans, there is heightened concern that they may evolve the ability to transmit between people and initiate a pandemic. They're still out there, still mutating. H7N9 may just be within 3 mutations away from effectively transmitting between people. Pandemics are always a matter of not if, but when. And a pandemic with more than a few percent mortality wouldn't just threaten financial markets, but civilization itself as we know it. How can we stop the emergence of pandemic viruses in the first place? If there's one concept to draw from my work on preventing and reversing chronic diseases, it's that, whenever possible, treat the cause. What does the poultry industry have to say for itself? The executive editor of Poultry magazine put it this way: the prospect of a virulent flu to which we have absolutely no resistance is frightening. However, to me the threat is much greater to the poultry industry. I'm not as worried about the U.S. human population dying from bird flu as I am that there will be no chicken to eat. Others are more self-reflective, drawing on his 37 years of experience witnessing the failings in the factory farming model in terms of spreading disease. One industry insider concluded his trade publication article, Poultry Reality Check Needed, with these prophetic words: "Now is the time to decide. We can go on with business as usual, hoping for the best as we charge headlong towards lower costs, or we can begin making the prudent moves needed to restore balance between economics and long-range avian health. We can pay now or we can pay later, but it should be known, and it must be said, one way or another, we will pay."
What does treat the cause look like when it comes to emerging infectious diseases? The last video I want to play you before getting to your questions is probably the most important video of the entire series: how to prevent the next pandemic.
Infectious diseases are emerging globally at an unprecedented rate. Literally hundreds of new pathogens have emerged and reemerged over the last few decades, and what we eat is responsible for most of the new diseases that have jumped from animals to humans. In response to the torrent of emerging zoonotic, or animal-to-human diseases, 3 of the world's leading authorities, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and the World Organization for Animal Health, held a joint consultation to determine the key underlying causes. First on their list was the increasing demand for animal protein. The greatest swords of Damocles dangling are the H5 and H7 bird flu viruses blanketing much of the Earth. A bird flu pandemic could be devastating, given their current upwards of Ebola-like flip-of-the-coin death rates. Given that the emergence of these deadly bird flu viruses, H5N1 and H7N9, are linked to intensification of the poultry sector, there have been calls for the deindustrialization of animal production. For example, as suggested here in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, replacing large industrial units with smaller farms with lower stocking densities, potentially resulting in less stress, less disease susceptibility, less intense infectious contact, and smaller infectious loads. Maybe they're the ones that could use a little social distancing. The American Public Health Association, the largest and oldest association of public health professionals in the world, has called for a moratorium on factory farming for nearly 2 decades now. Maybe COVID-19 is the dry run we needed, the fire drill to awake us from our complacency and reform the food system before it's too late. But if, as the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations visualized it, the next pandemic starts with increased demand for poultry products before ending up with human-to-human transmission, maybe we need to move beyond just giving these animals some more breathing room. This editorial in the Journal of the American Public Health Association goes beyond just calling for a de-intensification of the poultry industry, questioning the prudence of raising so many animals for food in the first place. It is curious, therefore, given the pandemic threat, that changing the way humans treat animals, most basically ceasing to eat them, or at the very least radically limiting the quantity of them that are eaten, is largely off the radar as a significant preventive measure. Such a change, if sufficiently adopted or imposed, could still reduce the chances of the much-feared influenza epidemic. It would be even more likely to prevent unknown future diseases that, in the absence of this change, may result from farming animals intensively and killing them for food. Yet humanity doesn't even consider this option. However, thanks to food innovations, this may be changing. Have you looked in the dairy case at the supermarket lately? Some of America's largest dairy producers have recently filed for bankruptcy due to the constellation of new consumer choices. I was peripherally involved in the largest meat recall in human history. Remember the footage of the cows getting forklifted? A hidden camera investigation at a California slaughter plant for spent dairy cows led to a recall of nearly 150 million pounds of beef for violations of food safety rules meant to protect the public from mad cow disease. Downed dairy cows, too sick to even walk, were being dragged to slaughter with chains into the federal school lunch program. You don't have to worry about contaminated cattle brains in your oat milk, though. Plant-based milks are a no-brainer. But you can see what I'm saying, right? Yes, you can pass public health regulations to stop the cannibalistic feeding of slaughterhouse waste to dairy cows, or you can just provide the public better alternatives and let the market eliminate the risk entirely because there's no prions in plants. HIV/AIDS likely rose from people slaughtering primates. 30 million people wouldn't be dead right now if we were eating meals from bushes instead of bush meat. We can't get coronaviruses from cauliflower. There is no flu in falafel production, no matter how tightly you crowd the balls together. What I'm saying is our food choices don't just affect our personal health, but our global health, not just in terms of climate change, but in terms of stifling pandemic risk. There's been a tremendous surge in interest in diversified protein sources, given the increasing consensus that reduced meat consumption is critical for addressing both the climate crisis and our burgeoning epidemics of lifestyle diseases. Eating less meat may not only help save the world, but could help prevent the loss of more than 10 million human lives a year. To their credit, in 2016, the Chinese government recommended that citizens cut their meat consumption in half, in part to reduce their growing rates of chronic disease. A completely plant-based diet might reap $30 trillion from the health benefits alone, and that would be just from the lowered rates of chronic diseases like cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, not even factoring in the decreased catastrophic pandemic risk. What we eat doesn't just affect our personal health, but our global health in more ways than one. Making healthier choices could also help mediate the next coronavirus epidemic, not only at the source by sidestepping wet markets, but by also decreasing the rates of comorbidities found to increase the risk in all the deadly coronaviruses— SARS, MERS, and COVID-19. Consider the underlying risk factors for COVID-19 severity and death: obesity, heart disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and chronic pulmonary disease. In virtually all studies, vegetable protein is superior to animal protein in terms of lower rates of heart disease and type 2 diabetes and lower blood pressure than animal protein. Here's a meta-analysis published a few months ago on diabetes risk in animal protein consumption. For hypertension, meat, including poultry, may contribute to a higher risk of high blood pressure. Meat may even be associated with impaired lung function, increasing the risk of lung diseases like emphysema. The same diet that can help you survive this pandemic can also help prevent the next. So instead of propping up the meat industry to the tune of $100 million taxpayer dollars a month and forcing meat plants to stay open, pandemic-proof your diet. Thankfully, expanded options are now hitting the meat case as well. No longer a niche market for vegetarians, major meat producers have started blending in vegetable proteins to make hybrid meat products like Purdue's Chicken Plus Nuggets or Tyson's Whole Blend Sausage Links. Smithfield, the world's largest pork producer, recently debuted an entire line of plant-based products. Hormel has a new plant-based line too. The purveyors of Spam now believe in the power of plants. Check out this headline from a few weeks ago. KFC to roll out Cargill's plant-based chicken across China. Talk about a cultural revolution. And we're not talking about tofurkey. Cargill is America's largest private corporation and one of the biggest meat packers in the world. How many fewer curly-tailed viral mixing vessels are there now that Dunkin' Donuts has a meat-free breakfast sausage? How many fewer hens are packed beak to beak now that egg-free mayo has taken the sandwich spread sector by storm? Quorn, a brand of meat-free meat made from the mushroom kingdom, opened a single facility that can produce the meat equivalent of 20 million chickens per year. These products may not be the healthiest from a personal standpoint. A donut sandwich without pork is still a donut sandwich. But hey, swap in an egg-free omelet from Tim Hortons, and from a pandemic standpoint, zero risk. Doesn't necessarily have to be plants, though. In this review on food systems in the era of the coronavirus, they noted that researchers are seeking alternative protein sources everywhere. Can't think of any possible alternatives to cow's milk? How about cockroach milk? I mean, you think almond milk is nuts? How about some of this on your cornflakes? Could be healthier than cow's milk, and hey, no lactose, no dairy allergy problems. An important alternative. I mean, I can't imagine anything else you can make milk out of. And gluten-free, too. The only downside, evidently, was the flavor, but the researchers, perhaps funded by Big Bug, chalked this up to the fact that the judges knew there were cockroaches in the bread, and so they were all just biased. I think I'll stick with the plans. But if you're like, you'll have to pry that pork chop from my cold, dead hands, we may be able to have our meat and eat it too. An even more innovative approach to pandemic prevention was suggested by Winston Churchill in 1932. In an article in Popular Mechanics entitled 50 Years Hence, he predicted that we shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing these parts separately under a suitable medium. And indeed, the prediction is becoming a reality. Instead of taking a cutting from a plant and growing vegetables, you're taking a sample from an animal and growing meat. Potentially lots of meat, like maybe 1 billion pounds from a single sample. Indeed, in terms of efficiency, growing meat straight from muscle cells could reduce greenhouse gas emissions and water use by as much as 96%, lower land use by as much as 99%. But when you factor in pandemic risk, the benefits to human health of a slaughter-free harvest could arguably rival those to planetary health. Food safety has been considered the primary human health benefit of such an approach. There's been a 6-fold increase in food poisoning over the last few decades, sickening tens of millions of Americans every year, and contaminated meats and animal products are the most common cause. So, when the cultivated meat industry calls its product clean meat, that's not just a nod to clean energy. Food poisoning pathogens like E. coli, Campylobacter, and Salmonella are due to fecal residue, traces of which are found on most poultry sampled in the United States and about half of retail ground beef and pork chops. They're intestinal bugs, so you don't have to worry about them if you're producing meat without intestines. You don't have to cook the crap out of meat if there's no crap to begin with. Just like you don't have to worry about brewing up new respiratory viruses that could kill millions of people if you're making meat without the lungs. A culinary choice in South China led to a fatal infection in Hong Kong and subsequently to 8,000 cases of severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, and nearly 1,000 deaths in 30 countries on 6 continents. If only we had learned our lesson then. We may be one bushmeat meal away from the next HIV, one pangolin plate away from the next killer coronaviruses, and one factory farm away from the next deadly flu. Tragically, it may take a pandemic with a virus like H5N1 before the world realizes the true cost of cheap chicken.
All righty then. Okay, we're going to take one final break, and then the entire rest of the time I am going to take your questions. The questions have been pouring in. You can take this time during this break to ask even more questions in hopes that I will get to them. So let's take a 5-minute break, and then we will be back with your questions. Thank you so much for joining me on this webinar. We're so excited to get these videos out to everybody. Welcome back, everyone. Just to wrap up the final video of the section, cheap chicken nuggets just ain't worth the risk. Now, just to be clear, as I said in the video, selling plant-based meat's not the healthiest from a personal health standpoint, from a chronic disease standpoint, but in terms of infectious disease, zero pandemic risk is presented. Now, you'll note that I kind of glossed over some of the details on how animal agriculture contributes to pandemic risk. What you really need is a comprehensive book with thousands of scientific citations. My new book, How to Survive a Pandemic, came out yesterday in both ebook and audiobook, which I record the voice for myself. You can order a physical copy too, though they won't ship until August 16th, I believe. But you can certainly pre-order it now. I'm going to paste the book page URL into the chat box so you can see the order link. Where's my chat box? Hold on. There we go, chat box. If you are interested, all right. All the proceeds, of course, from my book are donated. For this book are going to be donated to pandemic prevention charities, such as the Good Food Institute, the Plant-Based Foods Association, A Well-Fed World, and the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy. All right, let me stop sharing that. Okay, let us answer your questions. The Nutrition Facts team has been compiling them, and we'll just start from the top and go on down. Does a healthy microbiome provide protection from COVID? How much can gut health positively or negatively affect one's risk for both contracting and suffering serious consequences from COVID-19? I assume that this question arises because we know that having a healthy gut microbiome can significantly decrease the risk of upper respiratory tract infections in general, but we have no idea what the consequence of having a healthy or unhealthy microbiome means for COVID-19. The studies just have not been done. What do I think the future will look like? Will we always be wearing masks? Will this pass? What milestones do you think we need to pass to allow for social distancing measures to be relaxed? The CDC has a whole list of reopening criteria in terms of the relaxation of social distancing, and you'll note that about half the states are completely ignoring such recommendations, and that's not a good idea. And in terms of what's going to happen, you may have missed the video along the way where I talked about what we should expect in the future. It all comes down to herd immunity, which is accomplished two ways. The natural way, the only way to stop a pandemic is this so-called herd immunity, which means having a critical proportion of the population immune to the virus. An infection can only burn through a population if there are enough susceptible individuals for the viral sparks to kind of jump from one individual to the next. And so immune individuals who can't get the virus or transmit the virus acts as kind of fire breaks to control the spread. Ideally, this is accomplished through mass vaccination. Vaccines are a way to fight fire with fire, using the virus to fight the virus by generating the benefits of infection, which is immunity, without suffering the risks, which is disease and death. All right. It's kind of humbling to realize that, vaccines historically, on average, have taken more than a decade, 11 years on average, to actually be produced and have a 94% failure rate. Now, there are over 100 vaccine candidates in the pipeline, so we're assuming that a few are going to work. But we should not expect a vaccine to be available to the general population until at the absolute earliest, if everything goes good, into the second half of next year. So we are in for the long haul. And in terms of, and look, if we don't have a vaccine, then herd immunity is only achieved the hard way through mass infection. But we are a long way from there. I mean, the average infection rate using these serology studies in the U.S., the states is about 4%. The highest, someplace like Sweden, Stockholm, I think is up to about 20%, but still, again, we need like 60 or 70% of the population immune before we can sufficiently slow down this pandemic. And since so many people remain susceptible, there's a real concern for a fall wave, which, if it's gonna act like influenza, could be even more serious, particularly because we might have the flu around too, and that's gonna take up some of our ICU beds. And remember, flattening the curve was never about reducing mortality from the virus. Flattening the curve is just spreading out the deaths, spreading out the infections such that the hospitals won't be overwhelmed. Our healthcare system won't be overwhelmed. We got to spread it out. So if you need a bed, if you need a ventilator, it will be available to you. Okay, how reliable are COVID tests and antibody tests? We have yet to have one with 99% specificity and sensitivity, meaning lots of false negative, lots of false positives. There was kind of this overcorrection with the FDA. We bungled testing so badly that basically the FDA said, well, it was like the Wild West of, come up with any test you want and we'll kind of waive the testing, whether they're valid tests, and only later kind of rein that back in. So there are lots of lousy tests out there. And so that is certainly it presents a problem. We have yet to have sufficient testing, but we're working on it. Has there been any data on plant-based people with COVID? Do they have less symptoms or recover faster? Does it prevent from getting COVID-19? Well, as I said in the videos, right? Consider the underlying risk factors for COVID-19 severity and death: obesity, heart disease, right? Type 2 diabetes, right? Hypertension, right? All of which can be prevented, arrested, and even reversed with a healthy enough plant-based diet and lifestyle. And so look, take this opportunity, right? We've been, indoors for months. Take this opportunity to take care of yourself, to make yourself healthier, to be able to better withstand this disease. And then, of course, you'll have the long-term benefits in terms of reducing chronic disease risks. As I mentioned, excess fat alone seems to be a risk factor independent of diabetes. Even being skinnier than the average American, right? A BMI of 28. The average BMI is 29. Even being skinny, you still have so much excess fat that you may, sextuple your odds of a severe COVID-19 course. And I don't think I talked about it in the video, but the excess risk, we're not exactly sure why people with excess body fat have a worse course. We know people with who are obese have greater systemic inflammation. It may actually be epicardial fat, the fat that's actually on the heart muscle itself, or something called obesity hypoventilation syndrome. You just have so much fat in the chest wall that it kind of restricts your breathing, because the excess fatty tissue in the upper body. But even without taking weight into account, sadly, most American adults over the age 50 suffer from so-called comorbidity, which puts them at higher risk, such as lung disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, or cancer. So wait a second, how am I going to lose weight? If only there was another book with thousands of scientific citations. How Not to Diet came out in December. I only got a few months on the road to promote it, but I'm really proud of it, and some good light summer reading if you're interested. All right, next up on the list. Okay, What am I doing personally to avoid catching the virus and preventing the complications of the virus if infected? Well, I am, you can't get the virus unless the virus can get to you. And so how do you do that? The most important thing is to avoid enclosed, confined, indoor spaces, crowded spaces with other people. And so going outside, unless you have to go in an elevator with people down to the ground floor or something, going outside is extremely low risk behavior. You should go outside, you should enjoy, get some fresh air, go to the park, and as long as you're staying away from people, then it shouldn't be a problem. So go outside, enjoy this beautiful weather. If you're in an area where there is beautiful weather, it's the indoor confined spaces, particularly for extended periods of time, that really is the highest risk because it's these respiratory droplets that are exhaled when you speak and when you just breathe. So you just stay away from people and you will reduce your risk, particularly if you're over age 65 or if you come in contact with anyone over the age 65, then it's critically important that you continue to prevent yourself from getting infected. Remember, most infections happen from people that look perfectly fine, feel perfectly fine. For 48 hours before you start showing symptoms, before the first cough, before your fever spikes, you are exhaling virus with every breath. And you could be infecting people that you are around. All right. Okay. Am I worried that a vaccine will be rushed to market without proper testing? Yeah, I mean, there's only so much testing you can do for rare side effects. I mean, you can, so let's say you test a vaccine on 1,000 people and it appears perfectly safe. Well, what if there's a side effect that only happens 1 in 10,000 times? You may not pick it up, or 1 in a million times. You may not pick it up. It's all just like any medical intervention. It's all about risks versus benefits. I have confidence that any vaccine that comes to market, the benefits will outweigh the risks because this virus is risky, killing at about 1 in 250 people it infects, a case fatality rate of about 0.4%. Okay, what is my take on the latest drugs and vaccines that are either currently available for treatments or under trial, including hydroxychloroquine? There was just a meta-analysis in The Lancet, probably the most prestigious medical journal in the world, this last week, that looked at hydroxychloroquine. And this is the malaria drug that's been touted by some in this country. And it turns out that those taking this drug, either in combination with other drugs or alone, actually had higher hospital fatality rates and actually had more cardiac side effects, a higher risk of arrhythmias, heart arrhythmias. And so actually the World Health Organization has stopped testing it. They paused the testing just because they think that looks like it's actually making things worse. And so if I had the disease, I would not want to be taking hydroxychloroquine. Okay. How concerned should pregnant women be in the pandemic? What are the risks for pregnant women and their babies during the pandemic? What about newborns and infant risk? Okay. Thankfully, unlike swine flu, pregnant women are not at higher risk of a severe course than non-pregnant people, which is good news, because during pregnancy the immune system undergoes a number of changes in some diseases. Illness during pregnancy is worse. And we don't have instances of intra-utero transmission. So if the mother gets infected, then we don't have cases in the third trimester, for example. The baby is born without the infection. It does not seem to be spread through the placenta. Okay, what is the best way to stay safe if you have to travel? Again, the virus comes from other people. So if you have to travel rather than taking the train, renting a car and being the only person in the car, that's the way to do it. Yeah, so, again, indoor crowded spaces is not the place you want to be. Going around in your car, if you had to travel with other people in your car that aren't from your household, you could roll the windows down. There's ways you can kind of mitigate the risk, but that would not be the safest. Do I think that viral load or the amount of exposure has a role in the severity of illness experience? We actually don't know. There are some illnesses where, someone coughs right in your face, and you get a big dose and it's worse, but it's actually not clear if that happens with COVID-19. The COVID-19 virus. Does vitamin D or vitamin C help prevent contracting and or recovering from COVID-19? What about other vitamin and mineral deficiencies? There are critical vitamins and minerals necessary for proper immune function, like zinc and selenium, vitamin D, vitamin C, but there's little evidence that having supranormal levels helps you. So yes, if you're zinc deficient, taking zinc will help, as I said in that video. But if you have normal zinc levels, taking extra zinc doesn't necessarily help you. And so eating a healthy diet centered around whole plant foods, you should have all the nutrients you need for optimal immune health. Is it safe to go to the dentist? So it depends on how your dentist is doing things. I know, so I'm in Philadelphia, and there's some dentists that actually have like one patient in the office at the same time. You actually have to stay outside on the curb. You can't even take a family member in. So it's literally just you. And so you're not crowded in a waiting room. Again, it's that indoor space. But of course, so if your dentist or any of the staff in the office has the virus, unbeknownst to you, you could certainly get it. Again, it's just coming in contact with close contact with as few people as possible for as short a time as possible. That's the way you don't get infected. Remember, we're going to achieve herd immunity, 67% infected. Even if there isn't a vaccine. And so there's about a third of the people that are never going to get this. You want to be in that third. Even if you do get it, if you're healthy and young, the risk of dying is exceedingly small, but we don't want to take the risk. All right. And certainly, of course, we don't want to pass it along to anybody else. Can the virus spread through air vents in workplaces and apartment buildings? So that is a degree of airborne transmissibility, which we are uncertain about. So in these hospital room settings with people, you can detect evidence of traces of the virus in the air vents, but whether or not it can actually spread. So I talked about how in the hallway, in the air in the hallway right outside the room, they detected virus. Again, we don't know if it was actually infectious virus. It may just be traces of the virus at such a low concentration, wouldn't actually infect everyone. But we think it's mostly these larger droplets, which are spit out, breathed out, that just go out a few feet, 3 feet, 6 feet, before falling to the ground, but can build up in enclosed spaces, and you can get an infectious dose if you breathe too long in that kind of situation. Okay, if you have high blood pressure, prediabetes, but it's under good control with medication, do you have the comorbid risk level of someone without those risk factors? No, it's better. So if you are a diabetic with well-controlled blood sugars, that's better than being a diabetic without a controlled blood sugars, but it's not as good as being a non-diabetic with the same blood sugars. I would presume the same would be the case with high blood pressure. Having high blood pressure, even if it's being artificially lowered with medications, still means you have these clogged, crippled, stiffened arteries from a terrible diet and or smoking etc. All right, what are my thoughts on 5G and its relation to the pandemic? There is no relation between 5G and the pandemic, other than, boy, do they both bring out the crazies. In addition to your book, what are one to two of the most effective things to say or show to people who are in denial about this, how serious animal farming and confinement are in creating pandemics? So that's why I wrote the book, to really lay out the evidence. So I would share that critical reviews of microbiology paper that I wrote, which really, that's good for scientists. So if you, for lay people, my book is useful. Even though it's, 600 pages and 3,600 references, I mean, it's a big read, but I mean, you can read it with a non-scientific background. But for people who are into the science, then critical reviews of microbiology. So I think it was bit.ly/flu review. I would share that with them. You can just download the PDF. The American Journal of Public Health editorial, "The Chickens Come Home to Roost," very powerful, questioning whether we should be, eating animals in the first place because of the risks to human health. What else is there? Those would probably be the sources. I have not found other good kind of compilations of the data. And of course, there's lots. I mean, you can send people to the World Health Organization documents that I cite in my book, the World Organization for Animal Health, the leading veterinary authority on the planet, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. This is not a scientific question in the kind of public health sphere. So you ask the top flu scientists in the world, many of which actually wrote very nice things about my book Bird Flu back in 2006. This is what the science shows. It's just a matter of getting this out and turning it into policy. Is getting produce, eating raw foods, a risk if you can't fully cook or wash them? What should we do to disinfect our groceries when we bring home? What about mail packages or takeout? Early on in the pandemic, we weren't sure, but now, in fact, the CDC just changed the wording on their website, saying, re-emphasizing that it's these respiratory droplets that are the primary means of transmission. Yes, it's possible that these so-called fomites, meaning doorknobs and things like that, could cause indirect transmission if you don't wash your hands before touching your face. But we have now had people inside for months without external contact, just getting deliveries of food and groceries. And how many cases have there been of people picking up something on the mail or takeout? As far as I can tell, zero, not a single published case. And you'd think that would, I mean, people would scramble to do a case report, a case series. So millions of people indoors, no contact with people outside their household, except for getting deliveries. And how many of those became infected? As far as we can tell, none confirmed. And so extremely low risk. Now, do I think you should wash your hands, of course, after handling something that someone else handled? Absolutely. You can throw away the outer packaging, but it's not something that I personally worry about, because we're enough in that we would know if it was a higher risk than just this kind of theoretical risk. What's the safest way to exercise outside? Do the benefits of exercise outweigh the risks? The benefits of exercise absolutely outweigh the risk, unless you're, of course, crowded together. And so exercising outside is totally fine as long as you stay away from people. I mean, the virus is very rapidly dispersed. Talk about ventilation. Outside is 100% ventilation, right? It's the solution to pollution is dilution, meaning that there's an infectious dose. It's not like one little virus gets in you and causes the disease. You have to build up enough viral particles to reach the infectious dose, and you get that extended periods. When they do this contact tracing, when they're like, okay, who have you come in contact? So you come down with the illness, and they're like, okay, who'd you come in contact with? We have to tell them. They ask you, okay, over the last 48 hours. How many people have you spent 15 minutes with within 3 feet? because that's the real risk. I mean, that's the high risk. Someone you were talking to for over 15 minutes within 3 feet. That's who they're really concerned about. They'll go back and they'll call them up and say, see, you were just talking to somebody, and you should quarantine yourself for 14 days because you may have gotten an infectious dose. But that's really what we're talking about in terms of the highest risk. How can you wash or maybe disinfect an N95 mask or surgical mask? Actually, so heat. I talk about the temperature that's required to kill off the virus. The problem is we don't have testing in terms of how efficient the masks are being reused. These are really meant for kind of single use, like surgical masks are supposed to be disposed of after 4 hours or when they become wet, whichever comes first. They were never meant to be reused, and we don't know what the filtration efficiency is. And so ideally, we would not reuse them. But of course, anything's better than nothing. But the real concern with masks and face coverings is it's going to give people a false sense of security. So actually, there was a paper that was just published that found, using phone data, cell phone data, found that as soon as the mask regulations went into effect, they're like, okay, everyone going out, you have to wear a mask. You know what happens? People went out more. So if you actually track their phones, as soon as that went into effect, people were like, and they went out more thinking, oh, I'm protected because I have a mask. Remember, those masks are not protecting you. They're protecting others from you, primarily. So it's really a sign of respect to wear a mask because you're preventing others from being infected by you, rather than being particularly protected yourself. So, you know, you think you're all protected and, oh, I can go in a restaurant or a bar or, you know, hang around in the drugstore, in a crowded drugstore because I have a mask on. Remember, it's really not protecting you. That would be a risky thing to do, mask or no mask. All right, are there any health concerns with frequent use of ethyl alcohol hand sanitizers? Does hand sanitizer go bad? Or are there health concerns when using a mask for too long? The big problem with hand sanitizers, so, I mean, there's not just a theoretical risk, this actually happened once. If you had, there was one case in the literature, someone using an alcohol hand sanitizer, not rubbing their hands till they're dry, so they're still wet with alcohol. Then they like scuffed their feet, touched the doorknob, and a little spark set the alcohol on their hands aflame. They were okay, but you gotta rub until they're dry. But that's like, that's probably the only time that's ever happened. The biggest problem is dryness. So people who have atopic dermatitis, people have eczema on their fingertips, it can really dry out your hands. The alcohol can dry out your hands. That's why often emollients are used, like the glycerol. One thing you can do is apply hand lotion. So after you sanitize your hands with alcohol, or after hand washing, using a hand lotion, skin lotion, will help moisturize your hands so you don't get that kind of reaction. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on how the numbers of deaths are being recorded? The number of deaths from COVID-19, if you look at the excess deaths compared to like the same time last year, COVID-19 deaths are probably being undercounted rather than overcounted. The next question, do autoimmune diseases increase your risk of COVID-19? Well, the concern with autoimmune diseases is that many autoimmune diseases, right, it's your immune system attacking yourself. So what do? They put people on immunosuppressive drugs. These injectable biologics, people with ankylosing spondylitis or Crohn's disease or things that put on immunosuppressive drugs, and they go, well, this is a bad time to be suppressing your immune system. But like I was saying in the video today, people with compromised immune systems are not at increased risk for COVID-19 or SARS or MERS for that example. Why? Because the primary cause of lung damage is your own immune system, not the virus. We would not expect, and we have not seen increased risk of those on immunosuppressive drugs. And so if you need them for pain, for controlling autoimmune disease, I would recommend continuing to take them. All right, next, what is my view on ethnic minorities apparently being susceptible to COVID-19 complications? Is it genetic or socioeconomic? It is socioeconomic, and primarily through underlying risk factors. Much higher rates of diabetes among, for example, African Americans in the United States, higher rates of hypertension, again, among communities of color. Where does that primarily come from? It comes because the primary cause of all these chronic diseases is that their lifestyle, in terms of smoking rates, in terms of their diet, is worse. There's also there people who are lower socioeconomic class may live in crowded tenements, more likely to have to take public transportation, be around other people, all these or being forced to leave the house as essential workers, etc. These are all contribute to the higher rates of infection and complications. If one of us has history of an overactive immune system, like food allergy, rheumatoid arthritis, would that person have a higher risk of severe COVID infection or cytokine storm? Overactive immune system. No, I don't. Well, there hasn't been any data on those with allergies, rheumatoid arthritis having a higher risk. The same thing with autoimmune things, with higher risk of infection or cytokine storm. I have not seen that data. Data doesn't exist, but presumably if there was a really obvious effect, there would be papers on it. And boy, there are papers on everything. 300 papers every single day being published on PubMed on COVID-19. That's not including the preprints. I have been very busy staying on top of the science, as you can imagine. Given coronaviruses mutate all the time, isn't it in the interest of the virus? Oh, and it isn't in the interest of the virus to kill its host. Do you feel that SARS-CoV-2 will likely become an annual cold and less lethal? Well, no. See, that's a misunderstanding. The virus is jumping ship before you're hospitalized. Remember, it's that first week where the virus is replicating, spreading all over the place. And then the second week, when people are actually dying from this disease, getting a hospitalized ICU, the virus is kind of out of the picture. It's really your own immune system causing you all this problem. The virus doesn't care from an evolutionary standpoint. It's already jumped ship. It's already gotten out of there. That's its kind of life cycle. Its life strategy there really isn't this evolutionary pressure to become less lethal. The key is the incubation period, is the being infectious before you start showing symptoms. And that's the critical thing that differentiates it, unlike other deadly coronavirus outbreaks with SARS and MERS. It's like the flu, in that people can become contagious before showing symptoms. So days after being, days after you come in contact with the virus and become infected, you can look perfectly fine, feel perfectly fine, be exhaling virus with every breath. That's why these social distancing measures are so necessary, because without mass testing, you don't know who's infected. You don't know who's not infected. So that's why we're just trying to keep everybody apart from everybody else. That's the key to this virus's transmission, is this asymptomatic transmission. Either people who never become symptomatic and you have no idea they were infected, or they're that 48-hour period before they start showing symptoms where they're spreading the virus around and they have no idea. The reason why diseases become less serious over time is because you have a less susceptible population, because you have exposure to the virus in the past. So after a pandemic flu, for example, you know, it spreads. It can infect billions of people within a matter of months. No pre-existing, little or no pre-existing immunity, depending on the virus. But then when it comes around the next time, fewer people are infected because there's so many fire breaks, because there's so many immune individuals, and our immune system has a little kind of leg up. It's like, you know, when you give flu vaccines, it's not 100% protection, it's just partial protection, but the hope is that it's kind of close enough that it'll kind of decrease your risk of getting infected, and that's indeed what happens with the flu virus. I mean, the reason this is killing so many people is because it's infecting so many people. I mean, why is it infecting so many people? Because everybody's susceptible, because it's a new virus. It's not a new virus to the world. I mean, it's existed in animal populations, but it's a new virus to the human species. Everybody's susceptible, and that's why everyone starts out susceptible, and that's why even if it's just killing 250 people that show symptoms, well, if you infect millions of people, that's a lot of death and destruction. All right, where are we? Are men more likely to get COVID? And if so, does increased risk or more severity of symptoms have to do with merely chromosomal combinations or actual hormone levels? Men are more likely to get COVID-19, suffer severe course, but it's a few percent. You know, so, you know, it could be like, 48-52 kind of thing. So it's not like, so, I mean, statistically, yes, but, it doesn't help us actually with, who's particularly vulnerable, unlike something like age, where there's just an extreme difference between, healthy people in their 50s with, under 50 with, 1 in 1,000 risk of dying to somebody in their 80s, where it could be, 1 in 10 or worse. So, orders of magnitude different in terms of risk, whereas this is just a few percent at the margins. And we're still not exactly sure why, whether it has to do with, there's a number of determinants of immune system on the X chromosome. Women have 2, we only got 1, men only have 1. And so whether it's that, whether it has to do with hormones, we're not exactly sure why. Can sunshine prevent COVID or help with treatment? It can certainly destroy the virus outside. So in terms of disinfecting surfaces, so a doorknob in the sun is less likely to harbor virus versus the doorknob inside. But in terms of treatment, unless you were vitamin D deficient, we should not expect sunshine to actually help in terms of survival. How are we doing on time? Okay, is there any link between getting the flu vaccine and testing positive for COVID-19? No. 2 different viruses. All right, any guidance for the Kawasaki-like illness affecting children? That's this multi-system inflammatory kind of post-viral syndrome. This is not new. This is, you can see this Kawasaki-like illness. I mean, it was described well before COVID-19. It's extremely rare. In fact, children in general, thankfully, are unlikely to, are at less risk of getting the disease in the first place, less risk at suffering a severe course than adults. But there is indeed this rare syndrome. We're not exactly sure why it happens after various viral infections, but it does in rare cases. It's not a new phenomenon. Even with COVID-19, there were cases reported back in Italy months ago. It's just being kind of better characterized. And of course, the these media corporations, they're out to make money. And how do you make money? You scare people. You put a scary headline up. And so without giving people context, what's the denominator, how common some of these things are. And so I think that's why people are a little more freaked out than they need to be, not to minimize how horrific that particular inflammatory disorder can affect multiple organ systems, but again, extremely rare. Does hand sanitizer go bad? No, hand sanitizer does not go bad. There's no kind of expiration date, and so you don't have to worry about that. Are there health concerns with using a mask for too long? Well, the health concern is that the mask will become ineffective, and you'll be at higher risk. People touch their face with masks; it can infect their hands. There's the concept I was talking about where people just feel magically protected because they have a mask on and may take riskier, do riskier things. But in terms of like, this crazy conspiratorial, wearing a mask will like decrease your oxygen levels, make you more at risk, that's just crazy talk. How accurately can virus particles be distinguished from exosomes? That's some obscure microscopic question that I do not know the answer to. Do daily nasal rinses, interesting, help prevent catching the virus? Okay, well, we don't know about preventing catching the virus, but there was just a paper published, I was reading it this morning, on whether hypertonic nasal irrigation and gargling can decrease the risk of, can decrease the duration of upper respiratory tract infections, including with the common cold coronaviruses. And the answer appears to be yes. Although I have just read this latest randomized controlled trial, and it's possible that this study showed benefit, but there's been 20 others. I have yet to, you never look at one study in isolation. You look at the new study, you're like, wow, that's interesting. Let's look at every other study that's ever been done and see if this is like some fluke or this is what the best available balance of evidence says. I have yet to be able to do that because I just read it today. But the new study really is kind of exciting. It's basically taking 1 teaspoon of salt in a cup of boiled, then cooled water. You boil it to kill off any of these little amoebas that can give you bad sinus infections. Drinking water. So boil it to kill off the amoebas and then cool it down. Add a teaspoon of salt. So it should taste salty but not sting your mouth. And then in my family, we call it schnuffing. I think my family made that up unless it's some Yiddish word that actually means it, where you just kind of, you put a little in your mouth or a little in a cup and you snort it up, like neti pots. You snort it up your nose and then spit it out your mouth. You don't swallow it. And it cuts the duration of common cold, like 2 days, decreases symptoms. Oh, and most importantly, objective, it actually decreases viral loads in your nose, in the back of your throat. That's exciting. But again, we're not talking about COVID-19, talking about other upper respiratory tract infections, but it's like, well, there's no downside. There's no risk. And so, yeah, if I got COVID-19, I'd be nasal irrigating and gargling with this hypertonic, meaning a salty solution. But it's never been tested for actually COVID-19. But it's like the zinc lozenges. If taken as directed, it's not going to hurt you. So might as well kind of give it a try. What a great question, because I was just looking at that. Fascinating. All right. Is age being a risk factor of death a result of triaging? Why is age an independent risk factor if there's no chronic illnesses? Yeah. I wonder if, I forget if it was in this video series or I know I covered in the book. So if you're over age 65, even if you have no comorbidities, meaning you're just as healthy as someone in terms of, chronic disease risk, as someone under 65, you're still at, 3 times? I think 3 times the risk getting, 3 or 6 times the risk of being hospitalized or getting on a ventilator or dying. I'd have to look at the manuscript. But you're still at higher risk. Why is that the case? It has to do with changes in the immune function, we think. We're still not sure. I'm like, why don't kids get it? We don't know. Why don't kids get it as much? We don't know. But we presume it has something to do with changes in immune function as we age. And it's not immune senescence. It's not to show, well, your immune system falls as you age, because remember, it's your own immune system that's causing, that's the primary cause of the lung damage that leads to death. And so it's just a kind of an imbalance in your body's ability to control your immune function. Remember, we are but seconds away of total meltdown called anaphylaxis. You know, these people with like, peanut allergies, they eat a little peanuts and they're literally dead within minutes. That's how on a knife's edge, that's an immune reaction, inflammatory reaction. That's how on a knife edge, your immune system is ready to kill you, overreact at any moment. And so you have to have this massive other side of the immune system to dampen it down so you're not dying from eating peanuts all day or any other thing. And so it's this, we've evolved to have this massive ability to overreact, to underreact, to control, to suppress, to have just enough immune reaction to wipe out an invader, but not too much to kill us. And that imbalance, our body loses that ability to perfectly balance the various arms of the immune system as we age, and that's what we think is going on in terms of death as a risk factor. That's why it's critically important. Anyone who has contact with anyone over 65, whether themselves or someone else, really needs to make sure they are not infected. Okay. And how do you know if you're not infected? You don't come in contact with people. That's how you know you're not infected. Okay. Is it necessary for health professionals like physicians that have work assignments at hospitals to self-isolate from their family, like self-quarantine for 14 days after finishing a shift or work assignment? Well, there is certainly a concern, and it's not necessarily, even if you don't get infected, you may come home carrying it on your clothing. Like if you come in the door wearing the same clothes you left work from, before it gets into the washing machine, you can imagine, shaking it out. Someone touching it. So ideally, all that change would happen in the hospital. You would have enough protective gear that you wouldn't become infected, but you are obviously at high risk of infection if you're surrounding yourself. And there have been hundreds of fatalities among healthcare workers. And of course, we would not want to bring that home to the family. So yes, you are indeed at increased risk anytime you have contact with infected persons. And so, yeah, I would definitely be concerned. Do mosquitoes and ticks pose a danger for COVID? No. We have no data to support that. Does asthma increase your risk? It may not. Isn't that interesting? So the two things that you hear is, those that asthma are at higher risk and those who vape are at higher risk. We actually don't have data to support either of those. Now, vaping's not good for you. Asthma is not good for you, but the data supporting those, in fact, current smoking, you would assume current smokers would have higher risk, but the data is mixed there as well. But if you do have asthma, you should not fear that you are at higher risk, because the data actually does not seem to spell that out. I was just about to go on, but don't worry, there is more Q&A tomorrow. I've got 2 live Q&As, so I'm sorry we're running out of time here, but Facebook Live tomorrow at noon Eastern, and then YouTube Live at 1 p.m. Eastern. And let me paste those links. So live Q&As May 28th, that's tomorrow. Here are the links for both YouTube and Facebook for tomorrow. Sorry I didn't get to your question. Tomorrow there won't be 11,000 people. Well, there'll be a lot of people, but there may not be 11,000 people, so you can get your question in or have a higher likelihood of getting your question answered. I'm sorry if I wasn't able to get to yours. If you found this webinar useful, and if you are able, please consider making a donation to defray the cost of putting this on. Zoom charged us an extra $6,000 just to expand this single webinar past our 5,000 we have a 5,000 person plan, and we wanted to get at least 10,000 people into this one, but just doing it once cost $6,000. So if everyone listening right now donated just $1, that would totally cover it, right? So that would be like 25 cents an hour. Has this been worth 25 cents an hour? I hope you will consider it if you think it's worth it. If, however, of course, you are undergoing financial hardship, we do not want your money. We do not want your donation. But if you are able, you can go to NutritionFacts.org/donate. And I'll put that link in there. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and please stay safe.